The Quiet Zone. Book synopsis. Genre: contemporary suspense/social mystery/psychological drama. Target audience: readers of legal thrillers, character-driven mysteries, and political drama focused on institutional failures, e.g., the Lincoln lawyer meets the secret history of federal oversight. Pitch summary. In the isolated American Southwest lies the Mesa Blanca Corridor, a legally sanctioned, quiet zone where wireless signals fail, infrastructure is decades outdated, and the media refuses to tread. Officially, it protects Site K, a sensitive federal research facility. Unofficially, it has become a human containment field for those the system wants to silence. Federal Public Defender Hannah Cole, pragmatic and burned out, is sent here to clean up a stack of old, administrative anomalies. She expects dusty paperwork. Instead, she uncovers a decades-long program of coerced silence, wrongful convictions, and disappearances, a systemic effort to erase individual rights in the name of national security. Core narrative. Hannah Cole arrives from Washington, D.C., viewing her assignment as bureaucratic penance. But the cases defy logic. Court records stop abruptly, defendants plead guilty to non-crimes they don't recall, and the local community speaks in clipped, anxious warnings. With the reluctant help of Elias Moreno, a disgraced former journalist who knows the corridor's secrets, Hannah begins to connect the dots. The quick rotation of local judges, the ghost-like federal funding, and the pattern of relocations masked as standard prison transfers. The truth is darker than simple corruption. The Quiet Zone is a laboratory for invisible punishment, using isolation and geographical containment to control individuals deemed national security adjacent. As Hannah pushes closer to the truth behind Site K and its seemingly benign liaison, the polite and reasonable agent Paul Richter, the system fights back. Her access is revoked, her communications cut off even outside the zone, and Elias is threatened. Hannah is forced into a devastating choice: leak a partial, potentially survivable truth and watch the rest remain buried, or risk charges under federal secrecy laws to expose the full, chilling reality. The resolution is one of chilling realism. The system bends, but it does not break. A limited investigation is launched, and a few convictions are overturned, yet Site K remains operational. Hannah, fundamentally changed, abandons her DC career and stays in the desert, committed to continuing the slow, costly work of naming the erased. Themes: bureaucracy as violence. How impersonal administrative processes can systematically deny individual rights and freedom. The moral cost of secrecy. The societal price paid when national security is used as a moral blank check. Truth without an audience. The struggle to expose injustice when the public is unwilling or geographically unable to listen. Jacket blurb. Draft. You can only fight the machine if you can hear it coming. The Mesa Blanca Corridor is a legal anomaly, a vast, sun-bleached desert zone where the internet is a memory and the only broadcast is static. Officially, it's a necessary buffer for a secretive military research installation. Unofficially, the locals call it the Quiet Zone. Federal Public Defender Hannah Cole is sent from D.C. to Mesa Blanca for a simple task: clear up a backlog of administrative anomalies. Burned out and ready to fail, she expects heat and paperwork. Instead, she finds court dockets that vanish, defendants who pleaded guilty to nothing, and a pervasive silence enforced not by threat, but by absolute isolation. As Hannah begins to suspect the Quiet Zone isn't just forgotten, it's a calculated dumping ground for people the government needed to quietly erase, she finds an ally in Elias Moreno, a local handyman and former journalist haunted by the stories he couldn't publish. But the deeper Hannah digs, the more the silence tightens. When her phone stops working, her witnesses recant, and the polite federal liaison turns cold, she realizes she hasn't just uncovered a conspiracy. She is now trapped inside the very system designed to make people disappear. The Quiet Zone is a relentless contemporary suspense novel exploring the terrifying gray area where national security meets individual rights, and the true cost of being forgotten. Chapter 1: The Administrative Anomaly. The cell phone died exactly 47 miles past the state line. It didn't go dark with a warning or a low battery chime. It just gave up, leaving the screen displaying a single, defiant white word: "No service." Hannah Cole watched the word dissolve into the shimmering heat haze rising off the hood of her rental sedan. She had been on the phone with her DC office, a call about expense reports that felt laughably petty now, when the signal bar had dropped from 2 ticks to 0 in the span of one breath. She tried rebooting the device, then turning it off and on again, a sequence of increasingly desperate rituals that felt as useful as praying to the cracked asphalt of Highway 666. This was the Mesa Blanca corridor, the Quiet Zone. It wasn't a secret, just a place the 21st century had agreed to forget. Hannah wasn't easily unnerved. 42 years old, a federal public defender used to the high-pressure noise of DC courtrooms, she was pragmatic to a fault. She'd volunteered for this reassignment, a 6-week stint clearing administrative anomalies in the Southwest Field Office, mostly because she needed silence. She'd hoped for respite from the moral exhaustion of a system she could no longer pretend to fix. She hadn't counted on the literal silence. She pulled into the town of Ojo Oscuro, a collection of buildings that looked like they were leaning on each other for moral support. The federal courthouse, a squat structure built from stucco the color of dried blood, was the newest building in sight. It stood next to the Red Rock Motel, which boasted a landline phone number painted on its fading sign and a vacancy light powered by a flickering neon tube. The heat was an animal, pressing the air out of her lungs. Inside the courthouse, the air conditioning unit whined like an injured ghost. Hannah found the records room, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets that smelled of dust, old coffee, and mice. A single rotating box fan did little against the stifling air. A young clerk named David, skinny, nervous, wearing a shirt buttoned to his throat despite the temperature, gestured toward a stack of bankers' boxes labeled Legacy. "Miss Cole," he murmured, his voice too low for the room. "The files you requested. The anomalies." "Thank you, David." Hannah opened the first box. It was the case file she'd been sent to review. Old, low-level federal cases that had been flagged for incomplete resolution. The first file was Case 94, CR 22, United States v. Marco Robles, theft of government property. Robles was charged in 1994 with stealing a specific piece of specialized communication equipment from an unsecured military transport outside Site K. The equipment was never recovered. Hannah skimmed the details. A 30-year-old father, minimal criminal history. The anomaly, however, was glaring. Plea: guilty. Sentence: time served, 11 months. Fine: $1,000. Probation: lifetime supervision, but with the specific condition that Robles must remain within the legal boundaries of the Mesa Blanca corridor for the duration of his supervision. Hannah frowned. "David, what is this condition? Lifetime geographic confinement in a federal misdemeanor? That's not a standard plea deal." David wouldn't meet her eyes. He was meticulously dusting a perfectly clean corner of a filing cabinet. "That's just how the Robles case settled, ma'am. It's an old one. And the transcript? There isn't one." David shuffled his feet. "The judge on that case, Judge Albright," he rotated out quickly. "And the court recorder's tapes were corrupted. Magnetic interference. Happens a lot out here." Hannah looked back at the file. The signature on the plea agreement was shaky, almost illegible. Robles had a public defender at the time, but the lawyer's notes simply read, "Advised client to accept plea. Urgency required. Urgency required." to plead guilty to a non-violent theft charge with a lifetime sentence of internal exile, confined by silent geography. Hannah pulled out the next file. Case 02, CR 89, United States vs. Sarah Jennings, unauthorized entry. Jennings was charged with crossing a property line near the Site K perimeter. Guilty plea, time served, lifetime supervision confined to the corridor. The next. They all had the same pattern: minor, federal adjacent offenses, minimal evidence, quick guilty pleas, and the bizarre, geographically constrained supervision terms. Hannah felt the familiar professional weariness give way to something sharper, colder. This wasn't bad paperwork. This was systemic. She pulled out her useless phone one last time, needing to search the name Judge Albright, needing to email her supervisor, needing the tether to the reliable, noisy world. Nothing. Just the hot, buzzing silence of the quiet zone. She finally stood, closing the file box with a heavy thump. David flinched. Where is Marco Robles now? David? The young clerk glanced toward the door, his movements jerky. He's still around, I guess. Everyone who settles their case here, they tend to stay. He paused, lowering his voice until Hannah had to lean in to hear him over the whir of the box fan. The less attention they draw, the better their supervision seems to go, Ms. Cole. That's the one thing everyone around here understands. It was the first warning. Polite, quiet, and delivered with the certainty of a local truth. Hannah felt the weight of her assignment shift, feeling less like a bureaucratic cleaner and more like an accidental detective standing in a cemetery. The drive to the defunct gas station, located near the edge of Ojo Oscuro, was short but felt endless. The roads weren't crowded, but they were confusing. Sun-bleached signage was often wrong or missing entirely. Hannah relied on a printout map she'd brought from D.C., a relic that felt appropriate for the quiet zone. The address led her to a skeletal structure of faded turquoise and peeling white paint. The pumps were gone, leaving only concrete islands stained with decades of oil. The building itself was now a dusty, low-slung warehouse, its main windows boarded up. A beat-up pickup truck was parked next to the entrance, and the whine of a circular saw echoed from inside the gloom. Hannah parked and stepped out. The air here was drier than near the courthouse, tasting strongly of ozone and fine particulate dust. "Hello," she called out, walking toward the open loading bay door. The saw instantly went silent. A figure emerged from the deep shadow inside, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a lean man, mid-50s, with deep lines etched around eyes that looked permanently squinted against the sun. He wore faded denim and had the economical movements of someone who had done physical labor for a long time. This had to be Elias Moreno. "Place is closed, lady," he said, his voice flat and non-committal, tinged with a local accent Hannah couldn't quite place. "I'm not looking for gas," Hannah said, approaching cautiously. "I'm Hannah Cole, a public defender. I'm reviewing old federal cases." Elias stopped wiping his hands. His eyes moved quickly, taking in her rental car, her slightly wrinkled linen suit, and the expensive briefcase she carried. "DC cleanup crew. Richter send you over here to admire the old infrastructure." "Richter told me to certify the disposition and clear the backlog," Hannah corrected. "I came here because a man named Marco Robles listed this address as his place of employment in 1994, right before he pleaded guilty to a non-crime and received a sentence of lifetime geographic restriction." Elias dropped the rag onto a stack of lumber. "Robles. Marco Robles. He was quiet. Kept his head down. That's how you survive out here, federal." "He stole a piece of communications equipment," Hannah pressed. "Something proprietary to Site K. Do you know what actually happened?" Elias studied her for a long moment, deciding whether she was dangerous or just naive. You want to know what actually happened, Ms. Cole? What actually happens is the zone needs people. It needs compliant subjects to maintain its function as a void. Explain. Site K isn't just a research facility. It's a sponge. For decades, the federal system has needed a place to make problems go away quietly. A local gets near the perimeter, they see something, they hear something. It doesn't matter if it's classified or just mundane. That person becomes a risk. They can't just disappear them, not legally. So, they charge them with a vague, minor federal crime, offer an immediate deal, time served, fine paid. All they have to do is sign one unusual, binding probation condition. They can never leave the corridor. Hannah's mind raced, connecting it to the missing transcripts and Richter's explanation of anomalies. Containment by geography. They aren't imprisoned, they're simply contained by being placed on lifetime supervision in a desert nobody cares about. Exactly, Elias confirmed, a bitter taste in the word. The legal system used the map as a cage. Marco Robles didn't steal anything. He saw a truck where it shouldn't have been, or maybe he talked to the wrong guy at the wrong bar. They pressured him into taking a deal under duress so they could keep him in the zone, quiet. His public defender told him urgency required because a federal indictment is worse than being stuck in Ojo Oscuro, even for life. You speak about this like you know it, Hannah observed. Elias leaned back against the doorframe, crossing his arms. I wrote about it 10 years ago. Not the court cases, but the pattern of disappearances and the odd funding streams going to the local government. Too much money for so few residents. The piece ran in a small regional paper. The day after, the paper was bought out by a holding company, the editors were fired, and I was served with a nuisance lawsuit so complicated it would have bankrupted me trying to defend it. I lost my career, but I kept my life. He tapped his temple. The quiet zone isn't officially secret, Ms. Cole. It's just ignored. And I helped make sure it was. The quiet guilt that Hannah's profile mentioned hung heavy in the air. You're Elias Moreno, Hannah realized. The journalist. Elias shrugged. Now I fix broken things. Like this old gas station. Or maybe, like those old cases. What are you going to do about them? Expose the pattern to Agent Richter. I have a list of 27 names with the exact same geographical restriction and plea terms, Hannah said, pulling a folded copy of the first few files from her pocket. I was sent here to bury the anomalies, but I think I was sent here because they expected me to fail, or just leave. I need to find Robles. And I need to find out what Sarah Jennings saw before she was relocated. Elias took the list, scanning the names. He unfolded his arms, a hint of the old investigative spark returning to his eyes. You're going to need more than a printout map, federal. You need a guide. Someone who knows the local dirt, where the old landlines still connect, and how to spot a lie wrapped in an official regulation. Are you offering to help? I'm warning you, Elias corrected, handing the list back. Helping you means inviting the nuisance lawsuit, or something worse, back into my life. But if you're actually looking for the truth, and not just paperwork, you're looking for a pattern that begins and ends with Site K. And I know the geometry of this desert better than anyone. Hannah looked toward the highway, the sun beating down on the empty road. She felt the weight of Richter's polite warning, the cold reality of the erased lives in Ruth Calder's ledger, and the professional caution she had learned in D.C. She was alone here, cut off from her resources. I'll need a real map, Hannah said, her resolve hardening. And directions to Marco Robles. Chapter 4. The Snowplow Operator. Elias didn't produce a neat, store-bought map. He pulled a sheet of butcher paper from a roll inside his dusty workshop and spread it across a workbench covered in rusted gears. "This is a cadastral survey overlay," he explained, pulling a thick, black marker. "Property lines, utility easements, and, most importantly, the unofficial boundaries. The places the county technically owns but the federal government keeps clean." He drew a wide, irregular box around a central point, which he labeled Site K, redacted. "The quiet zone isn't defined by fences, it's defined by access, or lack thereof. The wireless interference you experienced is real, but it's targeted. It blankets the major roadways and most population centers. But if you take the old maintenance routes," he drew a shaky, broken line, "the signal drops off completely. They don't monitor the silence, they just create it." Hannah watched him draw, fascinated by his knowledge of the legal terrain. "And Marco Robles? He works here." Elias drew a small, square symbol on the edge of the large containment box. "County Maintenance Depot. They keep their fleet of heavy equipment there. Snow plows, even though we haven't had a significant snowfall in this valley in 20 years. Irony is heavy out here." "He maintains equipment used to clear roads that don't exist, so he can't leave the zone," Hannah murmured. "Invisible chains." "He is the definition of compliance," Elias agreed. "If you're going to talk to him, you don't do it at the depot. Richter's people have eyes everywhere that counts, and that includes Robles's life. You go to his trailer, after dark, and you go alone." "Alone?" "I'm the warning, Hannah," Elias said, using her first name for the first time, his tone serious. "My presence is a signal. Your presence is an administrative review. Keep it that way for now. I'll run the names on your list against the old land records for property transfers near Site K and see if any of the defendants suddenly acquired, or lost, land right before their plea deals." He tore off the section of butcher paper containing the depot's location and the sketch of the adjacent roads. Hannah folded it carefully and tucked it inside her suit jacket. That evening, the desert cooled to a manageable temperature, but the anxiety in Ojo Oscuro remained hot. Hannah followed Elias's directions using the odometer and the position of the few dim stars she could see. She found the trailer park on the far side of town, a collection of aluminum boxes arranged haphazardly beneath power lines that hummed audibly in the quiet. Marco Robles lived in a small, meticulously maintained single-wide trailer. A plastic Virgin Mary statue stood watch in a yard of gravel and potted succulents. Hannah knocked lightly. The door opened slowly, revealing a man whose face was etched with the passage of 30 years in the quiet zone. Marco Robles looked tired, cautious, and bone-thin, wearing a clean, faded t-shirt. "Mr. Robles, my name is Hannah Cole. I'm a public defender from the federal office. I'm reviewing your case, 94 CR 22. Robles paled instantly. He glanced over his shoulder into the darkened trailer interior, then quickly pulled the screen door closed, leaving only an inch crack. "I'm settled, ma'am. My case is settled. I paid the fine. I'm in compliance." His voice was a hurried, panicked whisper. "You don't need to be here. You need to leave." "I know your case summary says you stole a piece of communications equipment," Hannah said, speaking softly but clearly. "But I also know your plea deal mandated that you must never leave the Mesa Blanca corridor. That's highly irregular, Mr. Robles. It suggests the federal government wasn't worried about the theft, they were worried about you." Robles pressed his face against the crack in the door. His eyes, dark and wet with fear, locked onto hers. "It was a mistake. I made a mistake being there. They said if I didn't sign the paper, I would go to a real prison. Far away. They said my wife wouldn't be able to afford the gas to visit, and my kids would forget my face. They promised time served. It was urgency, ma'am. Urgency. What did you actually see near Site K that day, Mr. Robles? Robles swallowed hard, his throat clicking. He looked wildly around the trailer park, as if expecting Agent Richter to materialize from the shadows. It wasn't equipment, he whispered. It was a bus. A white bus, no markings, and it came in through the main gate, but it didn't stop at the guard post. And it was full. Full of who? People. They were sitting up straight, quiet. Too quiet. Like they were sedated, or maybe just exhausted. They were wearing regular clothes. But their faces, they were all looking straight ahead. And the bus driver, he wasn't military. He was wearing a lab coat. A lab coat, Ms. Cole. They brought people in a white bus, not equipment. I told my lawyer that, and the lawyer, the public defender, he just wrote urgency required and made me sign. Hannah felt a cold spike of certainty pierce the desert air. This was the legal gray area research on isolation, compliance, and memory, mentioned in her outline. They weren't just containing witnesses, they were relocating subjects. Did you tell anyone else? No. Never. That's how I've been able to stay quiet. Robles pleaded, his voice cracking. Please, you have to leave. Your car is wrong, your clothes are wrong. You're drawing attention. I'm fine. My case is settled. Just tell them I'm in compliance. Hannah realized she had pushed him to the edge of his carefully constructed silence. She stepped back, knowing she wouldn't get another word tonight. I understand, Mr. Robles. I won't come back here. But I'll remember what you told me. She drove away, the faint yellow glow of Robles's porch light shrinking in her rearview mirror. The information was explosive, but the fear was the real weapon. The zone didn't need guards, it had manufactured compliance. When she arrived back at the Red Rock Motel, her landline rang, shrill and startling in the dark room. She picked up. Hello. Did you find Marco Robles? Elias's voice, filtered through static, came through the line. I did. And I found out what he saw. It wasn't stolen equipment. It was a bus full of people in civilian clothes, driven by someone in a lab coat, going into Site K. A long pause hummed across the ancient connection. Relocated individuals, Elias breathed. Not criminals. Subjects. I told you this place was a sponge, but I didn't know it was that deep. I have 27 names on my list, Elias. We need to know where they were before they got here, and what they might have seen. I'm starting to think my job here is less about administrative review, and more about finding 27 missing persons. Then we have work to do, Federal, Elias said, a definite resolve now replacing his reluctance. We start finding out what kind of research requires lifetime confinement as a prerequisite. Meet me tomorrow morning, sunrise, at the gas station. Bring coffee. Chapter 5, Land Records and Ghost Towns. The desert sunrise was violent, painting the sky in aggressive shades of ochre and burnt sienna. By 6 a.m., the heat was already an insistent presence. Hannah found Elias waiting at the derelict gas station. He had pulled a folding chair from his workshop, and the smell of strong, freshly brewed coffee, carried in a dented thermos, cut through the metallic scent of dust and ozone. You're punctual, Elias observed, handing her a tin mug. I have 27 names that look like they were legally kidnapped, Hannah said, taking a grateful sip. Punctuality is the least of my concerns. She relayed the full details of her conversation with Marco Robles, the unmarked white bus, the quiet passengers, the driver in the lab coat. Elias listened without interrupting, his face grim. Subjects, not witnesses. I suspected the isolation research, but I thought it was localized, testing the effect of the low-frequency electromagnetic field on memory or compliance. But if they're importing people, that changes the scope. This isn't just about containing a secret, it's about controlling the subjects of a program. The files list the defendants' hometowns as locales like South Mesa County or Northern Arizona Territory, all vague or non-existent places, Hannah said, pulling out her list of names. We have to reverse engineer their lives. Where did they live, what did they do, and why did they draw attention from Site K? That's where I can help, Elias said, tapping his knee. I spent half the night on the county assessor's private dial-up archive. My old access codes still work, barely. I checked your list against local land transfers for the last 30 years. He pulled a second sheet of butcher paper, this one covered in dense, handwritten notes and dates. I found a pattern you won't see in the court records, he continued. 11 of your 27 names, including Robles, share one thing in common. Right before their plea deal was finalized, there was a quiet, private real estate transaction associated with their names. Hannah leaned closer. Did they sell property? No. They acquired it. Or rather, a shell corporation acquired it from them, or for them, in another state. Sarah Jennings, the woman Ruth Calder remembered being relocated to family in Nevada in 2002. 10 days before she signed her plea agreement here, a numbered LLC based in Reno bought a small, empty lot in rural Nevada in her name. Why would they buy them land? A paper trail, Elias explained, tapping the paper. If Sarah Jennings is legally relocated to Nevada, she needs a documented place to go. It makes the transfer look voluntary, like she's restarting her life, not disappearing into the desert. It's an administrative lubricant. The zone uses bureaucracy not just to hide people, but to provide them with a plausible external life they never actually get to live. Hannah felt a spike of professional admiration for the sheer, cold brilliance of the operation. They are manufacturing plausible deniability into the public record. The system doesn't commit murder, Hannah. It commits administration. Elias circled the name Sarah Jennings on the list. Marco Robles is too terrified to talk again. But Sarah Jennings is one of the disappeared. If they manufactured a paper trail for her exit, we can follow it back to her entrance. We need to know who she was before she entered the quiet zone without authorization in 2002. Nevada is too far, Hannah said. I can't access DC databases and I can't drive that far without drawing major attention. Elias smiled faintly, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. We don't start with Nevada. We start with the unauthorized entry charge. Everyone in the zone knows that unauthorized entry means getting too close to Site K's perimeter. But how did Sarah Jennings get to the middle of the New Mexico desert in the first place? Nobody just stumbles onto the Mesa Blanca corridor. Elias stood up and walked to his dusty, battered truck, retrieving a heavy, canvas-bound box from the passenger seat. This is the last of my journalistic capital. Old sources. Contacts in regional law enforcement who hate the feds as much as I do. We call this the broken compass. It's full of information that won't stand up in court but will point you in the right direction. He handed Hannah a slip of paper. Call this number. It's a landline out of Flagstaff. Ask for Billy, and tell him you're the lawyer for the Robles case. Billy used to monitor interstate transfers for a private transportation company. He might remember a white bus without markings moving a special, quiet passenger into the corridor in 2002. This is Act 2, Hannah stated, tucking the number away. Elias nodded, looking out toward the shimmering heat rising from the desert floor. Act 2 is where we stop clearing the anomaly and start proving the pattern. Chapter 6. The Landline Loop. The landline phone in Room 7 of the Red Rock Motel was a physical manifestation of the Quiet Zone's rules. It offered a connection to the outside world, but only on the zone's terms, a brittle, hard-wired link that allowed for no discretion, no encryption, and no cell tower hopping. Hannah sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, the scrap of butcher paper with Billy's number pressed flat on the desk. She knew the moment she dialed, the call would be logged, if not monitored. Richter had been explicitly clear about discretion. But this was necessary. She picked up the heavy receiver and dialed the 9 digits. The rotary phone issued a sequence of long, slow clicks that sounded agonizingly loud in the small, silent room. A man answered on the second ring, his voice gritty with lack of sleep and too much smoking. Flagstaff Freight Ops. Billy, Hannah asked. Who's asking? I'm the lawyer for the Robles case. Marco Robles. It's an old transfer matter, 1994. I have an administrative follow-up regarding a specific transport from 2002. A white passenger bus, no markings, headed into the Mesa Blanca corridor. There was a long silence, filled only by the crackle of the long-distance connection. Hannah held her breath, waiting for the hang-up. Robles' lawyer, Billy finally repeated, the skepticism thick in his voice. Yeah, I remember the white buses. We used to call them the ghosts. Special handling. They came in under a high-priority, non-disclosure manifest every few months for years. Different holding companies, same instructions. Do not query passenger manifest. Route direct to corridor delivery point. Hannah pressed the receiver tighter to her ear. I'm looking for a passenger in 2002. A woman named Sarah Jennings. Another pause, this one shorter. Wait. Jennings. Yeah, I remember that one. She wasn't a standard transfer. Most of the ghost runs originated from the big transfer hub in El Paso, but the Jennings run was a one-off. It came from the Midwest, way out of pattern. The Midwest where? A facility outside of St. Louis. I only know because the paperwork had to be rerouted through 3 different jurisdictions. I never saw the passenger, just the manifest. But the origin point was a low-profile federal research site. Not military, though. It was listed as the National Environmental Forensics Lab. Hannah frantically scribbled the name on the motel notepad. National Environmental Forensics Lab. It sounded innocuous, but a forensics lab involved in a transport to Site K in the desert strongly suggested an incident or an investigation. Billy, do you recall any details on why she was transferred? An incident, a case file number. I don't dig, counselor. Billy cut in, his voice suddenly hard. You're asking me to break a 20-year-old NDA just to clean up your paperwork. I gave you the location. That's enough. The last thing I need is a black sedan rolling up to my yard. Wait, one last question, Hannah pleaded. Were there other transfers from that forensics lab in St. Louis? Was it just Sarah? No, just her. That's why it stuck out. She was. The connection died. Not a clean hang-up, but a violent, sputtering rush of static that deafened Hannah's ear, followed by a profound, dead silence. She shook the receiver, but the line remained lifeless. It had been cleanly severed. Hannah carefully replaced the receiver on the cradle. She stared at the motel room door. The call hadn't been cut due to old equipment. The timing was too precise. She had hit a tripwire. She got up and walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy, sun-faded curtain. The motel parking lot was empty save for her rental car. She turned and walked to the door, checking the deadbolt. As she did, she noticed a slip of paper that had been slid under the door during the call. It was a standard-issue Federal Department of Energy memo pad, clean white paper. The message, handwritten in the neat, confident script she recognized from Agent Richter's handshake, contained a single, chilling sentence. "I trust your administrative review of the files remains efficient and focused on the disposition, Ms. Cole. The silence is there for a reason." Richter knew. Not only did he know she was digging outside the file boundaries, but he knew exactly when and how she was using the Red Rock landline. The silence was not just a side effect of Site K. It was a tool, allowing them to monitor the few remaining hardwired lines of communication. The quiet had stopped feeling like relief. Now, it felt like an audience. Hannah crumpled the note in her fist, then smoothed it out, tucking it into her pocket alongside her list of names and Elias's map. She had a location, the National Environmental Forensics Lab in St. Louis. She had a target, the truth behind Sarah Jennings's involuntary relocation. But now she knew she was working directly under the hostile gaze of the machine. The time for efficient administration was over. Chapter 7: The Blind Spot. Hannah met Elias later that morning at the maintenance depot, officially to finalize the arrangements for her rental car's mandatory desert service inspection. Unofficially, she showed him Richter's note. Elias studied the neat, chilling script, his face hardening. "The Red Rock landline is tapped into the courthouse switchboard. That line is less secure than whispering in Richter's ear." He handed the note back. "He's not just monitoring the calls, he's listening for the tone. He wants you scared and efficient." "I got the location," Hannah said, ignoring the tremor in her hands. "National Environmental Forensics Lab outside St. Louis. That's Sarah Jennings's origin point. It's a federal facility, which means there should be some public record, funding, personnel, anything that links it to Site K. The moment you search National Environmental Forensics Lab on any DC server, your account flags a national security search alert, even if you're using an outside connection," Elias warned. "We can't use the landline, and we can't use a public library terminal. The quiet zone doesn't have an internet connection, but every exit point is watched." "We need the internet," Hannah insisted. "I need public records, staff directories, or any news coverage of an incident in 2002 involving Sarah Jennings near that St. Louis lab." Elias walked over to a massive, idle snow plow, running his hand over the rusted blade. "The zone is a cage, Hannah, but every cage has a blind spot. The interference field is designed to contain digital signals and monitor hard lines. It is not designed to stop someone from driving out." He drew a quick diagram in the dust on the plow's hood. "The only major weakness in the zone's surveillance is the lack of population density on the perimeter's far side. Richter's surveillance is concentrated around Ojo Oscuro and Site K. There's a small, forgotten town called Bitter Creek, 80 miles north, just outside the official corridor boundary. No federal presence, no military installation, just a diner and a post office run by a woman named Dolly. A phone booth. Better. Dolly runs a legitimate, old-school dial-up internet cafe out of the back of the post office. It's too small, too slow, and too far for the federal budget to worry about. We can drive the rental there. It's a 6-hour round trip, and we'll be on the road during daylight, which is safer than darkness." Elias picked up his keys. "You don't know the access roads. And more importantly, if the DOE sees your rental car leaving the corridor without prior clearance, they'll pull your administrative pass before you hit the state line. I'm just a local handyman going out for supplies. They see me all the time." They set off in Elias's beat-up pickup, the rental left behind at the depot as planned. The drive was grueling, the truck rattling over roads that looked like dry riverbeds. Hours passed in near silence, Hannah trying to reconcile the vast emptiness with the chilling efficiency of the human control they were investigating. When they finally arrived at Bitter Creek, it was a welcome, dusty shock. The town was exactly as Elias described: 2 buildings, a couple of dogs sleeping in the shade, and a general air of benign neglect. The post office/diner smelled strongly of coffee and decades-old paper. Dolly, a woman with a beehive hairdo and perpetually flour-dusted hands, barely glanced up from weighing a package. In the back, tucked behind shelves of canned goods, was a single, humming computer terminal. It was slow, running an operating system Hannah hadn't seen since law school. "You've got about 30 minutes before Dolly gets suspicious and her dial-up overheats," Elias warned, standing guard by the entrance. Hannah worked fast, pulling up archives of federal agency staff directories and budget appropriations. She searched for National Environmental Forensics Lab and St. Louis. She hit pay dirt almost immediately. The lab was legitimate, focused on analyzing trace elements in environmental crime cases. But a key change in its funding stood out. In late 2001, the NEFL received a sudden, massive influx of special, non-appropriated funding labeled Project Chimera. Then, she found the news archives for the St. Louis area, searching for 2002. She found a single, small story buried on page A14 of a regional paper. Local woman missing. Sarah Jennings, 28, last seen leaving the National Environmental Forensics Lab facility where she worked as a junior research assistant. Police have few leads, and a federal spokesperson declined comment. A junior research assistant. Not a criminal trespasser, but an employee. Sarah Jennings hadn't just stumbled into the quiet zone. She had been transported directly from one federal facility to another, erasing her status from employee to defendant in the process. Hannah found the staff directory. Jennings's supervisor was listed as Dr. Alastair Finch, lead researcher, Project Chimera. Project Chimera. The name felt heavy, mythological, and sinister. Before she could dig deeper into Finch or the project, the slow dial-up connection stuttered and died with a high-pitched electronic squeal. "Time's up," Elias called from the doorway. Hannah grabbed a quick, blurry photo of the news article on her rental phone, still useless for calls, but capable of holding images, and logged off the archaic terminal. They drove back into the corridor, the sun setting behind them in a blood-red haze. Hannah had the pieces. The victims were subjects, their arrival was choreographed, and the key was a classified research project. They were 3 miles from Ojo Oscuro when the truck coughed, lurched violently, and died on the shoulder of the empty highway. "Engine trouble?" Hannah asked, already anticipating a far more dangerous problem. Elias climbed out, opening the hood. He studied the engine for a long minute, then turned back to Hannah, his face pale beneath the desert dust. "It's not the engine, Hannah. The distributor cap is gone. Cleanly removed. The truck has been sitting at the depot all morning. Someone was waiting for us to leave, and they made sure we had to walk the last 3 miles home." Richter just escalated his warning. Chapter 8. The Cost of Information. The walk back to Ojo Oscuro was slow, silent, and punitive. Every step on the gritty asphalt felt like a surrender to the watchful silence of the quiet zone. Elias had been right. The distributor cap wasn't missing due to engine failure, but a deliberate, surgical removal. It was a message. "We know exactly where you were, what you were doing, and we can stop you instantly." They finally reached the edge of town as the last vestiges of daylight disappeared. Elias stopped by his disabled truck, retrieving a spare cap from a hidden compartment. "Richter wants us to be tired, dirty, and thinking about how easily we can be isolated," Elias said, his voice low and tight as he secured the cap. "He's making us pay the cost of the information we gathered." Hannah's gaze swept the empty streets. The cost is worth it. We know Sarah Jennings wasn't a criminal. She was a junior research assistant working on Project Chimera at a federal forensics lab in St. Louis. She was transported here against her will, and then forced to plead guilty to unauthorized entry to justify her confinement in the corridor. We've moved from systemic injustice to conspiracy, Elias stated, checking his rearview mirror, though there was nothing there. Forensics lab. Chimera. The word means a monster composed of disparate parts. It suggests they are testing something that has multiple applications. Maybe environmental exposure, maybe psychological containment, maybe both. We need to know who Dr. Alastair Finch is and what Chimera was designed to achieve. I can't look him up again. Not until I leave the corridor, and Richter isn't going to let me leave now, Hannah said. They drove Elias's now functional truck back to the Red Rock Motel. Hannah went inside, pulling the Richter note from her pocket. She felt the cold dread that Richter intended, but it was mixed with the fierce resolve that had driven her through years of grinding legal work. She immediately crossed the street to the motel office. Ruth Calder was again hunched over her ledger, the low-wattage bulb casting deep shadows on her face. "You look tired, Federal," Ruth observed without looking up. "Been walking the desert?" "Someone disabled Elias Moreno's truck," Hannah said simply. Ruth finally lifted her eyes. They held a spark of knowing vindication. "They send you a note, then they take your wheels. That's the classic sequence. They don't want you to leave, and they don't want you to get too far out of sight. I need your help, Ruth. I need to find the other pieces of the monster." Hannah pulled out the blurry photo of the St. Louis News article she'd taken with her phone, the one mentioning Sarah Jennings's disappearance and the National Environmental Forensics Lab. She laid it flat on the counter. "I know Sarah Jennings was an employee at a federal facility, not a trespasser," Hannah explained. "She was brought here in 2002. I need to know if anyone else arrived in the corridor around that time, or if anyone left the corridor right before 2002. Anyone who might have been connected to that lab, or to the transfer itself." Ruth ran a manicured nail across the paper. She didn't look at the photo, only the date, 2002. "The ledger is good for dates," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. She opened the heavy book. The years leading up to 2002, things got very quiet. They were cleaning up. The only people coming in were official transfers or construction crews for Site K. But there was a strange one in 2001, right before your Sarah arrived. Ruth pointed to an entry in 2001. Guest name, J. Finch. Duration, 1 week. Purpose, field observation/survey. Notes, paid cash. Asked specific questions about the electromagnetic interference pattern on the north perimeter. Complained about the outdated infrastructure. J. Finch, Hannah murmured, her mind flashing back to the staff directory. Dr. Alastair Finch, lead researcher, Project Chimera. The supervisor of Sarah Jennings. The man who runs the program was here, a year before his assistant was forced into lifetime confinement, Hannah breathed, the implication settling heavily. He wasn't here to research the environment. He was here to scout the containment site for his human experiment. He checked out quietly, Ruth continued, looking at the next entry. But he left behind a box of papers in the crawlspace behind room 12. I never looked at them. Too dangerous. Hannah looked at the woman who had housed the lost souls of the quiet zone for decades. Ruth Calder was more than a motel owner. She was the last archivist of the zone's unofficial history. We need those papers, Ruth. They might contain details about Project Chimera that Richter made sure never made it to the court files. Ruth looked toward the motel room corridor, her expression unreadable. If I help you, Federal, you better do more than just overturn a few convictions. You better blow this whole damn place open. That's the only option left, Hannah confirmed. The alliance was sealed. Hannah and Elias had not only identified the mechanism of control, but had found a potential source of documentation inside the zone itself, forcing them into a high-stakes move in the heart of Richter's territory. Chapter 9. Project Chimera Protocols. The Red Rock Motel had been designed for maximum exposure, making any stealth operation feel suicidal. Room 12, Marco Robles's old room, was situated at the corner of the U-shape, giving it two exposed sides. Its crawlspace was accessible via a rusted grate on the exterior wall, facing the dark, cracked pavement of the service alley. The operation commenced just after midnight. Ojo Oscuro was entirely dark, save for the single flickering neon light of the motel sign and the distant, constant illumination over the fence of Site K. Elias, dressed in dark clothing, parked his truck 3 blocks away and approached on foot through the scrub brush behind the motel. Hannah waited in room 7, the landline receiver off the hook to give the impression of a persistent electronic fault, preventing monitoring. Ruth Calder, however, was the key. She sat in the motel office, her light on, sipping tea, a silent lookout. If any unfamiliar vehicle entered the main lot, she would flash the porch light 3 times. Hannah slipped out of room 7 and met Elias in the alley. The air was cool now, carrying the metallic scent of desert rain that would never fall. Richter's sedan is gone from the courthouse lot, Elias whispered, kneeling by the grate of room 12. But that doesn't mean his eyes are. We have less than 10 minutes. He quickly and silently pried the rusted grate off the crawlspace. The opening revealed only black, dusty earth and spiderwebs. It's small, Hannah noted. I'll go, Elias said, already reaching for a flashlight. You monitor the alley and the office. If Ruth flashes, you grab the first fire extinguisher you see and use it as a distraction. Elias slid into the narrow space, disappearing into the darkness beneath the room. Hannah stood rigid, her back to the stucco wall, heart hammering against her ribs. Every moment of silence felt stretched and brittle. She listened not for sound, but for the change in the absence of sound, the quiet that Richter weaponized. After 5 agonizing minutes, Elias backed out, covered in dirt and clutching a heavy, sealed metal box the size of a shoebox. Found it deep in the dirt, wrapped in a plastic tarp, he breathed, brushing the dust from his face. Let's move. They retreated to room 7 and locked the door, throwing the box onto the desk. Elias used a crowbar he'd brought, a tool of his trade now used for breaking and entering, to pop the thick, rusty clasp. Inside, the papers were yellowed but preserved. They weren't court documents or federal memos. They were high-level, technical research notes, all bearing the same watermark, Project Chimera, confidential/do EDOD oversight. Hannah, the lawyer, and Elias, the journalist, huddled over the box, tearing through the pages. The first major document was an internal proposal, psychological and neurological effects of long-term, geographically constrained isolation within a low-frequency electromagnetic field. Elias pointed to the introduction. They're testing the zone itself. The electromagnetic interference isn't just to block signals, it's a controlled variable. It's a research tool. Hannah found the next chilling piece, Subject Acquisition Protocol, Phase 2, 2002. Subjects must be individuals with documented proximity to sensitive research sites, e.g., NEFL, who possess critical, unclassified external knowledge, but who lack significant immediate family or media presence. Sarah Jennings, Hannah whispered. She knew things about Chimera, but maybe not classified things. They contained her not because she was a threat to security, but because she was a clean subject for the research, someone who could disappear easily. Elias uncovered a ledger of expenses, meticulously handwritten in J. Finch's precise script. It wasn't a budget, but a list of payoff recipients, local judges, unnamed federal marshals, and a final line item for long-term geographic compliance acquisition, Robles, M. et al. The payments that coerced the plea deals. The bureaucracy was bought and paid for. The last document was the most terrifying, Chimera Endpoint Analysis, projected 2025. Finch theorized that prolonged exposure to the zone's conditions would lead to a state of adaptive compliance, a complete inability to recall or articulate external events, rendering the subject unable to leave the geographic constraints even if physically able. They aren't just silencing them, Hannah said, the paper trembling in her hand. They're erasing their memory of the outside world. They're engineering compliance. Elias's eyes, fixed on the paper, looked haunted. We have the why and the how. This isn't just about overturning convictions. This is about shutting down a federally sponsored human experiment. A sudden, sharp rapping came at the door of room 7. Not a knock, but an insistent, official demand. Ms. Cole, I know you're in there. Agent Richter. We need to discuss the unauthorized use of the Red Rock landline. Hannah and Elias froze, the box of Chimera protocols spread out on the desk between them. Richter was at the door, silent and polite, but deadly. They were cornered, holding the evidence of a decades-long federal conspiracy. Chapter 10. The Negotiation of Silence. The rapping came again, harder this time, yet still calibrated to be strictly authoritative, not violent. Ms. Cole, open the door, please. I assure you, this can remain an administrative matter. Hannah and Elias locked eyes across the desk. The metal box was open, the incriminating documents, Finch's ledger, the acquisition protocol, the adaptive compliance analysis, were scattered between them. He heard the crowbar, Elias whispered, his hand instinctively moving toward the heavy tool. No, Hannah hissed, pushing the box and papers toward the bedside table. Violence is what he wants. It gives him jurisdiction. We deal with this administratively, like the lawyer and the liaison. She quickly gathered the most sensitive papers, the Chimera protocols and the endpoint analysis, and shoved them under the thin mattress. The ledger and the metal box remained on the desk, looking plausible enough to be Elias's tools or Hannah's initial case files. He knows we're both here, Elias warned. He tracked my truck. Stay behind me. You're a local handyman, here for maintenance. I'm the federal employee who is very concerned about the security of these files. Hannah walked to the door, took a slow, steady breath, and unlocked it. Agent Richter stood there alone, the only light source coming from the distant motel sign. He looked exactly as he always did, calm, polite, and reasonable. But the composure now felt like a tightly stretched wire. Agent Richter, Hannah said, opening the door only wide enough for her to stand in the gap. It's past midnight. I was asleep. Is this related to the unauthorized interference with my landline? Richter's gaze flicked past her shoulder, taking in the small room, the cluttered desk, and Elias Moreno standing silently near the window. His eyes lingered on the open metal box. This is related to the unauthorized acquisition of property, Ms. Cole, Richter said, his voice dropping in temperature. I was informed by Mrs. Calder that there were noise complaints emanating from room 12 tonight. And I can clearly see Mr. Moreno, a civilian with a history of documented hostility towards Site K, standing in a federal workers' room. Mr. Moreno is here to service my heating unit, Hannah lied smoothly, using a tired, annoyed DC tone. It's freezing in here, and I required immediate maintenance after my official vehicle was disabled. You have documentation on the truck. As for noise, I was startled by the persistent, unannounced rapping at my door. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the desk. And since you're here, perhaps you can explain this. I found this ledger. She picked up Finch's handwritten expense sheet in the crawlspace of the abandoned office next door. It appears to document significant, untaxed cash payments to local officials and defense contractors. If this is connected to the Department of Energy's oversight of the corridor, I need to know before I file my report. She flipped the ledger open to the page listing payoffs to local judges and marshals. This was the bait. It confirmed Richter's suspicion that she was investigating corruption, not the human experimentation. Richter's eyes narrowed slightly, the first break in his composure. The expenses were sensitive, but they were a manageable lie. Bribes were easier to explain away than adaptive compliance. That ledger is irrelevant to your administrative duties, Ms. Cole, Richter stated. It relates to legacy site acquisition costs, now fully depreciated. He stepped into the room, now taking control of the space. You have crossed a boundary. The moment you engaged in unsanctioned surveillance and solicited information from persons of interest, like the highly litigious Mr. Moreno, your authorization for this review was effectively terminated. He turned to Elias. Mr. Moreno, you are in the presence of classified federal property. I advise you to leave the premises immediately, or I will initiate charges for violating your former plea agreement regarding unauthorized proximity to federal operations. Elias held Hannah's gaze, understanding the danger. He slowly walked past Richter, who watched him like a hawk. As Elias reached the door, he paused and looked back at Hannah. The heat exchanger is going to need a full cleaning, Ms. Cole, Elias said, his voice flat. It's too cold in here to think straight. The message was clear. It's too cold to keep the papers safe here. Get them out. As Elias disappeared into the night, Richter turned back to Hannah, a sliver of menace entering his polite demeanor. I'm revoking your access, Ms. Cole. You are being relieved of your duties immediately due to unauthorized and overly disruptive investigative activities. Your office will be notified at 0900 tomorrow. I want the legacy files returned to the courthouse records room by dawn. You will wait here for transport to Albuquerque. He swept the expense ledger into his hand. This material is now in my custody. You will make no further inquiries. I have arranged for a replacement public defender to complete the administrative cleanup. Of course, Agent Richter, Hannah said, maintaining a mask of weary professionalism. She had lost her job, but she had kept the evidence. I look forward to briefing my superiors on the circumstances of my sudden termination. I will have the court files ready for pickup. Richter gave a tight, satisfied nod. He believed he had won, eliminating the source of disruption and retrieving the damaging, though secondary, ledger. He walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. Hannah stood motionless until she heard the distant slam of his sedan door and the engine fading. She rushed to the mattress, pulling out the Project Chimera documents. Richter was watching her. She couldn't wait for transport. She had to get the evidence out of the quiet zone entirely, now. But how? Her phone was useless, her access was cut, and her car was flagged. Her only contact was Elias, who was now under direct threat of arrest. Chapter 11. The Way Out. Hannah stood over the desk, the Project Chimera documents, proof of human experimentation and lifetime legal coercion, spread out before her. The silence in room 7 was total, broken only by the rapid pulse throbbing in her ears. Richter had bought their ruse, but only for a few hours. She checked the time on her analog wristwatch. 1:30 a.m. Richter's transport to Albuquerque was scheduled for 0900. She had less than 8 hours to move the evidence 80 miles through a surveillance field and across the quiet zone border. Her phone was a brick. Her official car was flagged. Her contact, Elias, was forced out and likely monitored. She had to rely on the only other variable in the zone, Ruth Calder. Hannah took the Chimera documents, 3 sheets of dense analysis, the acquisition protocol, and the payoff ledger, which Richter thought he had taken, and carefully folded them into quarters. She removed the heavy, flat battery pack from her useless laptop and sandwiched the papers inside the foam casing, securing the pack with duct tape from her luggage. It was bulky, but it hid the thin, yellowed paper texture from sight and touch. Next, she grabbed the stack of legacy case files that Richter had ordered returned by dawn. She wouldn't return them. She needed leverage, and the files were her cover. She wrapped herself in a dark jacket, slipped the hidden documents into an inner pocket, and quietly left the room, leaving the key in the lock. She crossed the street to the Red Rock Motel office. Ruth Calder was still there, sitting behind the counter, reading a paperback by the glow of a small desk lamp. Richter came and went, Hannah whispered. Ruth didn't look up, just turned a page. He stopped by on the way out to check on me. He thinks you're packing your bags and waiting nicely for the company car. He confiscated the expense ledger, but I still have the protocols. I've been relieved of duty, and transport arrives at 0900. I can't leave via the main road. No, Ruth agreed, finally looking at Hannah. Every car leaving the corridor before 0900 will be stopped. Even the Greyhound bus. I need to get this evidence to the outside, Ruth. I can't call, I can't drive. Is there another way out? An old service route that avoids the main federal access points. Ruth closed her book and pushed aside her teacup. She didn't look afraid, she looked determined. The quiet zone is bounded by a river gorge to the north. Used to be the only way supplies came in before the highway. There's a ferry crossing called the Devil's Armpit. But it stopped running 20 years ago. Is the road still passable? It is if you have a vehicle meant for it. And a reason to be out there. Ruth pointed to a rack by the door that held fishing rods and dusty tackle boxes. Every few months, my nephew, Leo, drives in from Farmington. He takes the ferry road. He carries our mail and supplies. He usually leaves about 4 a.m. to beat the heat, going out through the gorge. Does he know how to get past the zone sensors? He knows how to ignore everything, Ruth said, a faint smile touching her lips. He drives an old delivery van. It's insulated, shielded. Nobody pays attention to a beat-up local delivery route. I need to be on that van now. He's staying in room 1, by the way. And he's a very simple man, Hannah. He doesn't take passengers, and he doesn't want to know about federal protocols. You can't ask him to help you. You have to convince him you're a simple problem. Hannah understood the instruction. Do not involve him in the conspiracy. I need to drop off a few bundles of forgotten laundry at the laundromat in Farmington, Hannah said, pulling out the legacy files. A stack of papers I want shredded before I leave the state. Ruth nodded, approving the cover story. Room 1. Tell him Ruth said you're a pain in the neck, but pay him cash and he'll take you. Hannah walked back across the lot, her shadow long and distorted under the flickering sign. She found room 1. The door was slightly ajar to let in the cool night air. Inside, a huge man with a gentle face was methodically packing boxes of mail and supplies into canvas bags. Leo. He looked up, surprised. Yes, ma'am. I'm Hannah Cole, from room 7. Your Aunt Ruth sent me. I have an administrative issue. I was unexpectedly called out of town this morning, but I have a large stack of old paperwork, client files, that needs to be securely shredded in Farmington before my flight. Can you take me and the papers? She placed $100 bill on the nearest box. Leo eyed the cash, then the towering stack of official federal files. The ferry road is rough, ma'am. And I don't usually take passengers. It's just me and the files, Hannah assured him. They're confidential. They can't go through the regular mail or shipping channels. It's just a quick ride to Farmington, drop off the files, and I'll catch a cab to Albuquerque from there. Ruth said you're leaving at 4 a.m. Leo scratched his beard. The cash, the desperate story, and the implied secrecy of the paperwork were a language he understood. 4 a.m. sharp. Be ready at the back door of the office. Hannah returned to room 7, gathered her essentials, and waited. The next few hours were the longest of her life, spent in the dark, watching the clock tick, the chimera documents pressed flat against her ribs. At 3:55 a.m., she met Leo at the back door. He didn't ask questions. He simply helped her load the heavy box of legacy files into the back of his ancient, windowless white delivery van, its engine rumbling low and deep, the perfect vehicle for ignoring. Hannah slipped into the passenger seat, gripping the hidden documents. As the van pulled onto the deserted highway, heading not toward the main federal exit, but toward the dark, unmonitored gorge, she realized she hadn't completely escaped. She was a lawyer, now a fugitive, carrying federal secrets, dependent on a driver who knew nothing. And Elias was still behind the wall. The wall was breached, but the war was far from over. Chapter 12: The Devil's Armpit. The old delivery van, a battered Ford Econoline from the early 80s, was a fortress of mundane anonymity. Its rattling engine and squeaky suspension were noise in the service of invisibility. It wasn't just old, it was built before advanced tracking technology, its thick metal body acting as an effective Faraday cage against the faint electromagnetic field that defined the quiet zone. Leo drove with the quiet, intense focus of a man who traveled this road often, navigating by memory rather than light. The road itself was a nightmare, a narrow, pitted track that snaked alongside a sheer drop into the unseen river gorge below. "This is the ferry road," Leo said once, his voice muffled by the sound of the tires crunching over loose rock. "Nobody uses it. Too much trouble." "What about the ferry?" Hannah asked, gripping the dashboard. The laptop battery pack containing the Chimera protocols felt like a lead weight pressing into her side. "Just the name now," Leo replied, his eyes glued to the dark track ahead. "The river changed course 20 years ago. The crossing is mostly dry rock and mud flats. Hardest part is the sensor array." Hannah leaned forward. "Sensor array? The bridge used to be right here." Leo slowed the van, pointing a massive hand toward a chasm where the road abruptly ended in a sheer, 50-foot drop. The federal boys put up a lot of specialized gear after the ferry stopped running. Not cameras. Sound, wait, maybe some kind of low-frequency radar, to detect large movement trying to exit the corridor this way. Hannah swallowed. "How do we get past it?" "We don't," Leo said, turning the wheel sharply. He guided the van onto what looked like nothing more than a deer path, snaking away from the chasm toward a narrow, treacherous slope leading down into the dry gorge floor. "We go under it. The sensors are aimed at the old crossing height. Too much interference down in the riverbed. Too many rocks and shadows." The descent was brutal. The van bucked and slid over boulders, the metal protesting loudly with every impact. Hannah was thrown against the seatbelt, fighting to keep the heavy stack of legacy files from spilling from the floor and revealing her cargo. Leo, however, was unnervingly calm, maneuvering the vehicle with the delicate touch of a veteran mountain driver. They reached the bottom, the air thick and cold in the depths of the gorge, the devil's armpit. Above them, the stars were visible, but the rim of the canyon was shrouded in thick, unnerving shadow. Leo drove the van slowly through the dried-up riverbed, the tires splashing in pockets of stagnant water. The silence here was different. It wasn't the monitored hush of Ojo Oscuro, it was the raw, empty silence of geology. After 20 minutes of painful grinding progress, the riverbed began to rise. Leo pulled the van over, cutting the engine. The resulting silence was absolute. "We stop here," Leo whispered, checking his rearview mirrors, although there was nothing but canyon walls behind them. "The exit point is right above. There's a magnetic anomaly in the rock formation here. It's the only place the federal signal doesn't bounce." He pulled out a small, old-fashioned stopwatch. "We wait 3 minutes. Let the sensors reset." Hannah reached into her jacket and touched the hard edge of the laptop battery pack containing the Chimera documents. She realized she was trembling, not from cold, but from adrenaline that had nowhere to go. The 3 minutes dragged by, endless and terrifying. Then, Leo restarted the van. He drove hard up the final, steep incline. The van roared, spitting gravel, and burst onto a flat, unpaved road. They were on high ground again, and the horizon was beginning to glow with the first, faint hint of pre-dawn light. Leo didn't slow down. He accelerated past a rusty, forgotten sign that read, in faded script, "Entering San Juan County." A moment later, Hannah felt it. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a sudden violent sensation of her inner ears popping, like breaking through water. The cold, binding quiet of the corridor vanished. The air felt louder, clearer, and somehow more vibrant. Hannah involuntarily reached for her phone in her jacket pocket. The screen, which had been stubbornly black for days, suddenly flashed with a series of aggressive, stacked notifications, texts, emails, and missed call alerts, all flooding in at once. NO service had been replaced by a triumphant 4G LTE. "We're out," Leo said, his focus still on the road. That was the line. "Don't look back." Hannah quickly typed a single, encrypted message to her boss's private email address in D.C., attaching a photo of the blurry news article about Sarah Jennings's disappearance. Subject: Administrative Review Complete. Evidence of Federal Misconduct. Project Chimera Protocols. Location: Farmington, New Mexico. Contact my assistant, Elias Moreno, for details. Do not reply to this email. She hit send. The confirmation of the email leaving the phone's outbox was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. She looked out the window. The eastern sky was brilliant with fire, and the landscape was shifting from the brutal beige of the corridor to the deeper reds and greens of the wider southwest. She had the evidence, but Elias was still behind the wall, and Richter knew he was her key witness. Hannah was now a lawyer without a badge, a fugitive with a mission, and the first of the people connected to the quiet zone to successfully tell the outside world that the silence was a lie. Chapter 13: The Echo of the Quiet Zone. The delivery van arrived in Farmington an hour after sunrise. Leo dropped Hannah off at a small, legitimate-looking laundry and dry-cleaning establishment, accepting the cash with a simple nod and no further questions. He was a man of transactions, not conspiracies. Hannah watched the beat-up van disappear back toward the mountains, a dirty, rattling lifeline to the terrifying place she had just escaped. Hannah didn't waste a second. She found a secure Wi-Fi connection at a coffee shop and initiated 2 immediate actions. First, she uploaded high-resolution scans of the Project Chimera protocols, the acquisition plan, and Finch's endpoint analysis to a secure, encrypted server with instructions for her DC boss on how to access the decryption key. The physical battery pack was still on her person, but the digital evidence was now safe. Second, she used the flood of incoming alerts on her newly functional phone to determine the immediate fallout. Her federal email was already locked, and she had 4 missed calls from an unknown number that she recognized as belonging to the Department of Energy's administrative pool, Richter's people. The administrative machine had begun its work. The critical concern, however, was Elias. She quickly dialed the only number she had for him, the defunct landline at the gas station. It rang once, twice, then a male voice answered, crisp and official, but not Elias. Ojo Oscuro Maintenance Depot. I was trying to reach Elias Moreno, Hannah said, keeping her voice level. Mr. Moreno is currently engaged in essential maintenance activities. He is unavailable for the foreseeable future. If you have an administrative inquiry, please direct it to Agent Richter at the courthouse. The line clicked dead. Richter hadn't just watched Elias go, he had acted immediately, using the legal threat of the unauthorized proximity charge to silence him and prevent him from leaving the corridor. Elias was now a captive witness. Hannah's blood ran cold. She had secured the evidence, but she had endangered her only ally. She needed to go dark, but she also needed to coordinate. She found a payphone, another anachronism, and dialed the private number of her DC boss, Deputy Chief Public Defender, and Voss, and answered on the first ring, her voice tight with professional alarm. Hannah? Where the hell are you? Richter terminated your assignment this morning for unauthorized activities and is claiming you stole federal files. I'm out, and I'm in Farmington, and I didn't steal files, I extracted evidence. Hannah summarized the entire conspiracy in 30 rapid-fire seconds. The bogus charges, the lifetime geographic confinement, the shell corporations, Sarah Jennings, Dr. Finch, and the existence of Project Chimera as a human experiment in adaptive compliance. A human experiment? Lifetime confinement? Hannah, this is... The protocols are uploaded to the secure server, Hannah interrupted. Decryption key is quiet zone. The files prove every word. But Richter has detained my key witness, Elias Moreno, in Ojo Oscuro. He's listed as a maintenance worker, but he's a former investigative journalist. Richter will make him disappear by noon. And was silent for a terrifying moment, the background hum of DC traffic a distant counterpoint to the desert drama. I see it, Hannah. The Chimera files, they're real. They're sickening. This is above my pay grade, Hannah, and way above yours. This is a federal crime of unimaginable scope. Then you need to deploy the leverage, Hannah said, her lawyerly instincts kicking in even as she stood on the run. Richter is expecting me to return to D.C. for a disciplinary hearing. Instead, call the Inspector General's office, not the DOE, but the Judiciary Committee's IG, with an anonymous tip that a public defender has been illegally detained and relieved of duty for uncovering classified documents related to an unconstitutional program. You need to create so much noise that Richter can't move Elias without attracting national media attention. And you. I'm going dark. I have to go back for Elias. Richter will be waiting for me to turn myself in, which means he won't be watching the corridor from the outside. I need a place to regroup and plan the extraction. And sighed, the sound heavy with resignation and reluctant admiration. You're either going to prison or the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I'll initiate the leverage. Get safe, Hannah. And don't contact me again unless it's an emergency code. Hannah hung up the phone. The lawyer was back. She was no longer running away from the quiet zone. She was finding a way to get back in. She turned her attention to the legacy files, the box of names she had brought out with her. She had a list of 27 victims, and she had the means to save one of them. The choice was clear: the extraction of the witness must come first. She found a cheap motel near the edge of town, paid cash for a single night, and pulled out the maps and notes Elias had given her. She needed a new vehicle, a new identity, and a plan that exploited Richter's arrogance, the same arrogance that made him believe he had successfully silenced the quiet zone forever. Chapter 14: The Maintenance Order. Hannah spent the day transforming herself. The cheap motel room, smelling of industrial cleaner and stale cigarette smoke, became her temporary operations center. She ditched the tailored linen suit and bought 2 sets of clothing at a large, anonymous box store: men's work shirts, faded denim, and scuffed boots. She tied her dark hair back aggressively beneath a baseball cap and used minimal makeup to exaggerate the dark circles under her eyes, lending her the look of someone permanently overworked and underpaid. The lawyer was gone, replaced by a ghost. Her next move was the vehicle. She couldn't risk renting, as that would leave a paper and digital trail. Instead, she found a Craigslist ad for a dilapidated, high-mileage Ford Ranger pickup being sold for cash by a local mechanic who wanted it gone by evening. It was loud, reliable, and entirely forgettable, exactly what she needed to look like just another contractor heading into the dusty interior. By nightfall, Hannah had the truck, the disguise, and the most valuable asset of all, the box of legacy files. She spread the files across the motel bed, searching for the perfect point of re-entry. Richter's confidence was her weakness, but it was also her greatest advantage. He expected her to disappear, to use the Chimera protocols to hire a high-powered attorney, or to go straight to the media. He expected her to run from the zone. He would be watching the borders and the major out-of-state connections. He wouldn't expect her to drive straight back in through the front gate. She needed a legitimate reason to pass the initial security checkpoint, a reason so boring and bureaucratic that it would immediately be accepted by low-level DOE security staff. Rummaging through the legacy files, she found an old, innocuous form: County Asset Maintenance Schedule Request, Form 31B, 1998 edition. It detailed the planned annual service for heavy equipment, including the snowplows at the Ojo Oscuro Maintenance Depot, the same place where Elias was now being held. The maintenance requests were typically handled by local contractors operating under a broad, low-bid federal contract, a perfect bureaucratic blind spot. Hannah retrieved her laptop and the now empty battery pack. She carefully created a dummy digital version of Form 31B, mimicking the 1998 typeface and county letterhead. She forged a signature and assigned herself a new corporate name: Desert Vista Mechanical Solutions, a sole proprietorship. The maintenance job: emergency replacement of distributor caps and ignition coils for 3 county vehicles, including Snow Plow Unit 4, located at Ojo Oscuro Depot. It was a beautiful cover. It was so dull, so administrative, and so utterly necessary for the continued smooth operation of the county assets that Richter's people would be conditioned to wave her through. The fact that the job included the replacement of a distributor cap, the very item Richter had removed from Elias's truck, was a deliberate, bitter irony. She studied the map Elias had sketched, focusing on the layout of the maintenance depot. Elias's workshop was a standalone building. The surrounding depot yard contained the heavy equipment and a small storage shed. Plan: infiltration: drive the Ford Ranger through the main corridor checkpoint using the fabricated maintenance request form, establishing herself as Desert Vista Mechanical Solutions. Contact: find Elias at the maintenance depot, under the guise of starting the emergency repairs. Extraction: she needed a powerful distraction. Elias had been working on the defunct gas station. It was loaded with flammables and utilities, perfect for creating a spectacular diversion far from the courthouse. Before leaving, Hannah pulled out the laptop battery pack, running her hand over the duct tape that had secured the Chimera protocols. She was going back for Elias, But she wasn't just bringing him out. She was bringing the full glare of the outside world back to the quiet zone. She tucked the maintenance request and a small satchel of tools, bought with cash, into the front seat. The Ford Ranger coughed to life, sounding like every other vehicle belonging to every other small-time contractor in the state. At 1 a.m., Hannah drove toward the dark, foreboding mountains, leaving the bright lights of Farmington behind. She was headed straight into the jurisdiction of Agent Richter, armed with nothing but a forged maintenance form and a deep understanding of the law he had perverted. The lawyer was back, and she was coming home. Chapter 15. The Bureaucratic Barrier. The drive from Farmington was long and solitary, the Ford Ranger's ancient headlights barely cutting through the oppressive darkness that preceded the corridor checkpoint. The quiet zone was marked not by a gate, but by a sudden, jarring change in road quality, the asphalt crumbling into a coarse, federal-grade surface. At 3:30 a.m., Hannah approached the entry point. It wasn't a military base, but a nondescript, concrete structure that housed a small guard booth and a heavy steel barrier arm. The area was lit by harsh floodlights that cast long, skeletal shadows. A lone guard, a young man in a DOE security uniform, emerged from the booth, looking bored and cold. He carried a clipboard and a demeanor of minimum efficiency. This was exactly the kind of low-level bureaucrat Hannah had hoped for, someone who preferred the path of least resistance. Hannah stopped the Ranger and rolled down the window. The smell of oil and old gasoline from the truck filled the gap. "State your purpose and destination," the guard droned, not making eye contact, his flashlight beam fixed on the truck's dusty license plate. "Emergency maintenance run," Hannah said, adopting a tired, no-nonsense drawl. She kept her voice low, the baseball cap pulled down, obscuring most of her face. "Desert Vista Mechanical Solutions. We got a Form 31B issued late last night. Got 3 vehicles at the Ojo Oscuro Depot down due to ignition failure." She handed him the forged County Asset Maintenance Schedule request, Form 31B, 1998 edition. The paper, slightly crumpled and grease-stained from her preparation, looked authentic. The guard took the form. He didn't check the signature or the dates, he checked the code. 31B, he muttered, flipping pages on his own official clipboard. "Yeah, I see the blanket order for emergency parts replacement. Why is this showing up after hours? That's usually a day shift item. I'm doing 3 separate vehicles, including Snow Plow Unit 4, Hannah lied, leaning into the professional jargon. The county vehicles are critical assets. The work has to be done before 0700 shift change. We got delayed getting the distributor caps out of Albuquerque." The guard paused, his flashlight beam running over the line item for distributor caps and ignition coils. Hannah felt a cold sweat on her palms. He was confirming the what, not the who. He pulled a small handheld device from his belt and quickly scanned the truck's VIN number. The silence stretched, the only sound the Ranger's ticking engine cooling down. "Vehicle check clear for contract access," the guard announced, finally satisfied with the technical compliance. He signed the bottom of her forged form, effectively validating her existence as Desert Vista Mechanical Solutions within the quiet zone's bureaucracy. He handed the form back and gave a quick, bored wave. "You know the drill. Straight route to the depot. No detours. No communication past the town line. You finish by 0700, you're clear to leave. If you're not out by 0730, we come looking for you." The steel barrier arm lifted with a grinding hydraulic hiss. Hannah nodded, gave a weary salute, and drove the Ford Ranger through the checkpoint. As she drove onto the quiet zone's interior roads, the subtle, low-frequency hum of the electromagnetic field immediately began to press in on the cab, silencing the sporadic radio interference she'd picked up outside. Her phone, safely tucked away, was now officially a brick again. The dark town of Ojo Oscuro soon appeared ahead, a cluster of dim lights surrounding the high, cold glow of Site K's perimeter lighting. She drove past the Red Rock Motel, her old rental car still sitting abandoned in the lot, confirming Richter's false sense of victory. The maintenance depot was located on the far side of the town, closer to the zone's central area. It was a sprawling, dimly lit yard filled with heavy machinery. The workshop building was dark, except for one small, rectangular window at the rear, which emitted a weak, yellow glow, a single, occupied room. Hannah pulled the Ranger around the side of the main building, positioning it near the large loading door, where it looked like a service vehicle reporting for duty. She killed the engine and sat in the sudden, echoing silence. She was back inside the cage. She retrieved her small satchel of tools, a length of heavy-duty nylon rope she'd bought, and the forged Form 31B. She walked toward the single-lit window, moving quickly but without panic. Peering through the dusty glass, she saw him. Elias Moreno was sitting on a folding cot in a small, windowless office space off the main workshop floor. He was reading by the light of a bare bulb, not a prisoner in a cell, but a detainee under guard. His guard was a heavy-set DOE security officer, awake but distracted, sitting by a desk, listening to a faint, crackling radio and nursing a thermal mug. The workshop was the prison, and Elias was the asset Richter was waiting to dispose of. Hannah had infiltrated. Now she had to move quickly to contact Elias and initiate the extraction plan, the spectacular distraction at the defunct gas station that would force Richter to move his assets. Chapter 16: The Signal and the Spark. Hannah moved around the side of the workshop building, hugging the massive bulk of a parked snow plow for cover. The air inside the maintenance depot felt heavy, thick with the smell of diesel, grease, and the cold, charged atmosphere of the zone. The small office window was her only point of contact. The DOE security officer inside was engrossed in his radio, the faint, static-laced sound confirming the low-frequency interference was disrupting even the official channels. Hannah needed a signal that was loud enough to break through Elias's focus on his book, but subtle enough not to alert the bored, distracted guard. She quietly removed the distributor cap from Snowplow Unit 4, the exact component her forged Form 31B claimed she was there to replace. She needed to establish her cover immediately. She placed the old oil-caked cap on the running board of her Ranger. Next, she took a single, small stone and flicked it across the dusty pavement. It hit the window of the office with a faint tick. The guard jumped, looked up, and squinted out into the dark yard, seeing nothing but the shapes of heavy equipment. He dismissed it as settling metal or a rodent and returned to his radio. Elias, however, was a journalist used to receiving information in coded silence. His head snapped up, not toward the sound, but toward the window's glass. He saw only his own reflection and the shapes of the machinery outside. Hannah flicked a second, larger stone. Talk. This time, Elias didn't move. His eyes went still, focusing on a spot just above the guard's head, where he could track movement without looking directly at the window. Hannah quickly drew a small, recognizable symbol in the dust on the outside of the window with her finger, the outline of the two intersecting circles that made up the zone's perimeter on Elias's old map. Elias saw the symbol, the graphic language of their brief, shared investigation. He understood immediately. She was back. He casually stood up and stretched, walking slowly toward the desk. "Mind if I get some coffee, officer?" Elias asked, his voice calm. "It's going to be a long night for both of us." The guard grunted. "Stay in sight." Elias walked to a small counter, which was also near the back wall, parallel to the window. He poured himself a cup from the communal pot, his back now to the guard, giving him a few crucial seconds of cover. Hannah quickly produced her last communication tool, a thick piece of cardstock, on which she had written 4 simple words in large, block letters. Gas station. Flame. 4:30. She pressed the cardstock flat against the dusty window. Elias glanced up, his eyes meeting the stark message. Gas station. Flame. 4:30. He absorbed it instantly. The old, defunct gas station was the single biggest store of potential flammable material near Ojo Oscuro. A spectacular controlled fire there would draw every available security asset away from the depot and the courthouse, including Agent Richter. Elias nodded, almost imperceptibly, as he turned back to the guard. He had the time, the target, and the method. Tastes like old oil, Elias commented, returning to his cot. The guard only shrugged. Hannah pulled back from the window and headed straight for the large loading door, using the paperwork in her pocket as her shield. She needed to execute the next critical part of the plan, the rendezvous and the setup. She found a padlock securing the heavy chain on the loading door. Using a small set of lockpicks she'd purchased, another skill she hadn't known she possessed until desperation demanded it, she quickly sprung the lock. She didn't open the door yet, but positioned a heavy piece of equipment nearby to hold it slightly ajar. Next, she needed a distraction inside the workshop itself. She spotted a series of large, cylindrical oxygen tanks used for welding. They were heavy, cumbersome, and entirely out of place for a distributor cap replacement. Moving swiftly and silently, Hannah began to arrange the largest, heaviest cylinders near the back wall, adjacent to the small office where Elias was detained. She set them up like dominoes, ready to be pushed with minimal effort, creating a loud, terrifying cascade of sound and motion. She needed to get back to the Ranger and wait. She had told Elias 4:30 a.m., but she needed to be in position for the signal. The spectacular distraction was Elias's job. Her job was to secure the way out, and then secure the witness. As she climbed back into the driver's seat of the Ford Ranger, she checked her watch. 4:05 a.m. 25 minutes until the ignition. She quietly backed the Ranger out of the depot and drove onto the deserted main street of Ojo Oscuro, heading back toward the Red Rock Motel, where the abandoned, defunct gas station stood like a beacon of flammable opportunity. The extraction was in motion, but every action she took in this silent, monitored space was a direct challenge to Agent Richter, who was already on high alert, waiting for her next move. Chapter 17. The Ignition. Hannah parked the Ford Ranger 2 blocks from the derelict gas station. The timing was critical. She had to be close enough to see the ignition at 4:30 a.m., but far enough away to avoid the initial security cordon that would inevitably descend on the scene. She killed the engine and sat in the dark, her hands gripping the wheel. The air was cold, the silence immense. The faint, metallic odor of the quiet zone's constant interference was a physical presence. The time on her watch ticked toward 4:30. Meanwhile, back at the maintenance depot, Elias Moreno was meticulously preparing his signal. He had been watching the security officer for the last 20 minutes. The guard was slumped in his chair, half dozing, the static from his radio a comforting, monotonous sound. Elias knew he couldn't leave quietly. The guard would inevitably check on him before the shift change at 0700. He needed chaos. He glanced at his cheap plastic watch. 4:29 a.m. Elias, still holding his book, walked casually to the counter to pour a last cup of coffee. As he did, he subtly kicked the leg of the counter, just hard enough to send the coffee pot rattling. The guard stirred, annoyed. "What was that, Moreno?" "Just getting my caffeine fix, officer," Elias replied, yawning wide. At 4:30 a.m. precisely, Elias executed his first move. He placed the distributor cap Hannah had left on the Ranger's running board, the symbolic replacement for the one Richter had stolen, into the communal coffee pot water reservoir. The sudden change in the water's mineral composition caused the old heating element to short-circuit with a loud, violent crack. The bulb over the counter exploded, plunging the small office into darkness and filling it with the acrid smell of burnt wiring. The security officer roared, scrambling for his flashlight and his sidearm. Elias didn't wait. He used the cover of the initial noise and darkness to shoulder the first oxygen cylinder Hannah had arranged. The heavy tank tipped, sending a chain reaction through the stacked cylinders. They crashed to the concrete floor with a deafening, metallic thunder, a noise that sounded like a gunfight in the confined space. "Down! Shots fired!" the guard screamed into his radio, convinced the noise was an armed assault, exactly the type of high-level threat that would justify a violent response. Elias sprinted for the rear loading door. The padlock was sprung, the chain easily pulled aside. He squeezed through the small gap Hannah had left, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness of the depot yard. He ran hard, not toward the street, but toward a hidden cluster of scrub brush he'd scoped out near the perimeter fence, watching for his signal. In the empty street of Ojo Oscuro, Hannah stared at the clock on her dashboard. 4:33 a.m. She had heard nothing but the faint, constant hum of the zone. Doubt began to claw at her resolution. Then, from the direction of the abandoned gas station, the very place she had parked just 20 minutes earlier, a pillar of deep, orange fire erupted skyward. It wasn't a muffled bang, it was the slow, controlled whoosh of ruptured gas lines meeting an ignition source. Elias must have accessed the old, corroded underground tanks before he was caught. The fire was immediate, spectacular, and utterly undeniable. The flames, starved of oxygen in the early morning air, climbed hundreds of feet, briefly lighting the entire valley floor and painting the distant fence of Site K in a terrifying orange glow. The quiet zone was quiet no more. Almost instantly, the town's minimal emergency lights flared to life. Hannah saw two Department of Energy SUVs, one of them Agent Richter's familiar black sedan, peel out from the courthouse, sirens muted but emergency lights blazing, racing toward the scene of the massive fire. Every available security asset was converging on the gas station, drawn by the catastrophic visual signal. The depot was now officially abandoned. Hannah reversed the Ranger and drove hard back toward the maintenance depot. She pulled the truck up to the loading door, which was now swinging loosely. "Elias!" she hissed, stepping out into the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness under the snow plow, covered in grease and soot. "I think I startled the maintenance chief," Elias gasped, jogging to the truck. It was just a short, controlled blast, but it bought us 5 minutes. "Get in," Hannah ordered. "I'm the designated emergency maintenance contractor." Elias climbed into the passenger seat of the Ford Ranger, throwing his heavy coat over his head. Hannah slammed the truck into gear, and they sped away from the depot. They drove directly onto the main road, not hiding, but moving with the official authority of a vehicle that was expected to be in motion, a maintenance crew moving to the disaster site. They passed the stream of emergency vehicles speeding toward the huge, burning gas station. Through the haze of lights and smoke, Hannah saw Agent Richter, his face illuminated by the fire, shouting into a radio handset, his features contorted in disbelief and rage. He was looking the wrong way. The evidence was secured, the witness was in the cab beside her, and they were already moving toward the bureaucratic blind spot, the main checkpoint, armed with the forged Form 31B, a vehicle that was meant to be here, and the perfect, necessary cover, the raging fire that they themselves had started. The silence was broken. Chapter 18. The Final Clearance. Hannah drove with the rigid, practiced calm of a seasoned operative, a persona built entirely on lies and desperation. Elias, slouched in the passenger seat, was covered in soot, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the rearview mirror. They were moving against the stream. Every other vehicle on the road was racing toward the enormous, blazing beacon of the defunct gas station. The fire was a perfect distraction, too spectacular to ignore, too simple to immediately trace to two individuals, and demanding all available assets. As they approached the main federal checkpoint, the bureaucratic barrier Hannah had breached hours earlier, the scene was one of controlled, but distinct, panic. The steel barrier arm was raised, and the harsh floodlights were blinding. However, the usual lone guard was gone. In his place stood a supervisor, wearing a slightly cleaner uniform and a harried expression, shouting into a crackling handheld radio. The air was thick with smoke drifting in from the east, and the radio transmissions were punctuated by static and emergency codes. Hannah slowed the Ford Ranger, adopting the frustrated, impatient posture of a contractor whose critical mission was being hampered by incompetence. "Stop! Stop!" the supervisor barked, waving his arm frantically. "All non-emergency vehicles are to turn around. There is a high-level incident in the settlement." Hannah brought the Ranger to a halt, leaning out the window. "We are emergency, Chief," she snapped, using the noise of the radio static and the commotion to her advantage. "We're Desert Vista Mechanical. We're inbound for the depot, but now we're diverted. Form 31B, emergency parts replacement for the snow plows. We were told we had to get these distributor caps back to Albuquerque immediately for tracking before the morning flight." She shoved the fabricated Form 31B under his nose. "We've got critical county assets down, Chief. If those plows aren't working by the time the DOE assets are cleared from the site, we're going to have a jurisdictional crisis. We were just pulled from the depot." The supervisor didn't even look at the form. His mind was consumed by the fire and the stream of contradictory radio reports. He saw a filthy, disgruntled contractor talking about bureaucratic procedure and critical asset tracking, the exact kind of mundane problem he couldn't afford to deal with right now. "Fine, fine, go," he yelled, waving them past the checkpoint. "Just get that paperwork out of my sight. You are cleared to exit. Do not stop until you hit the interstate." Hannah gave a quick, sharp nod of acknowledgement, shifted the Ranger into gear, and drove across the boundary line. There was no immediate pursuit. They were just another vehicle exiting, documented, and officially authorized. Richter's focus, his rage and his resources, was entirely consumed by the roaring inferno at the gas station. He had been looking for a sophisticated intelligence leak, a lawyer with a briefcase, not a desperate woman and a journalist in a beat-up truck with a false maintenance order. A minute later, the truck hit the familiar, uneven state road outside the federal jurisdiction. They were moving fast. Elias, who had been holding his breath, let it out in a long, rattling gust. That was administrative poetry. "Never underestimate the power of bureaucracy," Hannah said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "It's the one system they can't break their own rules for, even when the world is burning." She kept driving hard, watching the odometer climb. The air felt cleaner with every mile. The rising sun, now fully clear of the horizon, began to turn the sky the color of gold and faded denim. Then, about 20 miles out, it happened. The low, binding hum that had pressed against their eardrums for days vanished. It wasn't a sudden pop like the ferry road, it was a slow, final release. The radio crackled to life, picking up a distant, legitimate country station. Elias's phone, tucked into his pocket, vibrated violently, coming back online with a rush of digital notifications. They were free. Hannah slowed the truck, pulling onto the shoulder of the road. She killed the engine and rested her head on the steering wheel, finally allowing the tension to break. Elias reached over, his hand resting briefly on her arm. "You did it, Hannah. You got the evidence, and you got us both out. The zone is quiet no more." Hannah straightened up, reaching into her jacket. She pulled out the bulky laptop battery pack, ripping off the duct tape. She retrieved the thin, precious Chimera protocols, Finch's analysis, the acquisition plan, and the ledger, and handed the stack to Elias. "The digital files are already safe. Now we give them the witness and the testimony," Hannah said, the professional clarity returning, sharper than ever. "We have Sarah Jennings's fate. We have 27 names inside. We have the protocols for a federally sanctioned human rights violation. Richter is about to find out what happens when a public defender takes off her suit jacket and starts fighting for her clients." Chapter 19. The Net Cast Wide. The first stop was a small, prepaid burner phone store in a dusty strip mall just off the interstate. While Elias made contact with his old network of investigative journalists, the ones who knew how to handle sensitive, potentially fatal, information, Hannah made her professional call. She used the secure line to contact Voss, her boss, who answered immediately, her voice strained. "Hannah, the Inspector General's office is already spinning up a preliminary inquiry based on the anonymous tip. The keywords alone, unconstitutional detainment, classified protocols, DOE overreach, have forced their hand. We bought you some time. Richter will know that noise came from DC, Hannah warned. He'll realize I didn't just vanish, I leveraged. Is Elias's safety guaranteed?" "For now, yes. With the IG circling, Richter can't touch him inside the corridor without raising a massive red flag. But that protection stops at the border. You need to get Elias and those physical files into federal jurisdiction, certified, and under seal immediately. Get to DC. Or better yet, New York. We'll arrange a safe house and a meeting with the right people at the New York Tribune, Elias's old paper." "Understood. We're moving." Hannah glanced across the parking lot. Elias was finishing his call, his face grim. They drove east, alternating between the Ranger and a series of anonymous rental cars, paid for entirely with cash. They were ghosts in motion, fueled by adrenaline and the grim knowledge contained in the Chimera protocols. 2 days later, they reached a secure, nondescript apartment complex in Brooklyn, New York. The physical protocols were sealed in a safe deposit box. The digital files were locked away. Elias was ready to testify, and Hannah was ready to lead the legal onslaught. That night, watching a quiet snow fall over the Manhattan skyline, Elias handed Hannah a clean, new suit, a gift from Voss. "It's time to stop dressing like a fugitive and start dressing like the lawyer who burned down a federal human rights violation," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. Hannah took the suit. She was putting on her armor. The next morning, the first article dropped. It wasn't the full story, not yet, but it was the necessary crack in the dam. The New York Tribune ran a front-page exposé, "The Quiet Zone, Mysterious New Mexico Facility Subject of Federal Inquiry into Unconstitutional Detainment." The article detailed the case of Marco Robles, the strange plea deals, and the disappearance of the former public defender, Hannah Cole, claiming she vanished after uncovering evidence of systemic corruption. The political world erupted. The Department of Energy and the Department of Defense issued immediate, furious denials, claiming the inquiry was based on the unfounded allegations of a disgruntled, terminated employee. But the real crisis was back in Ojo Oscuro. Agent Richter, sitting in his now under siege courthouse office, read the article, his face a mask of cold fury. He knew the source was not the corruption ledger Hannah had baited him with. The article was too precise, too targeted on the legal anomalies. He knew she had escaped with the core truth. He placed a call to his director in Langley. The protocols are out. We have a witness on the outside, and the media fire is spreading. The IG is mobilizing. We will handle the political fallout, the voice on the other end replied, devoid of emotion. But the legal integrity of Site K must be maintained. You know what you have to do, Agent Richter. Neutralize the threat. Richter looked out his window at the scorched ground where the gas station had stood. He had underestimated the lawyer's tenacity. He would not make that mistake again. He turned his attention to the second page of the Tribune exposé. It contained a sidebar, a photo of the Red Rock Motel, and a small, grainy image of Ruth Calder, the owner, identified as a local source. Richter gave a slow, predatory smile. He couldn't reach Hannah or Elias in New York, and he couldn't touch the names on the list. But he could reach the one person who knew exactly how Hannah escaped. The net was cast wide, but the quiet zone always started by tightening the grip on its nearest point of contact. Richter stood up, grabbing his jacket. It was time to pay a visit to Ruth Calder. Chapter 20. The Archive Keeper. The drive from the courthouse to the Red Rock Motel was short but charged with Richter's barely contained fury. The media exposure hadn't just been an attack on the operation, it was a personal failure. Hannah Cole, the incompetent lawyer, had outsmarted him, and the key to her escape was the quiet woman who ran the only motel in Ojo Oscuro. He found Ruth Calder exactly where she always was, behind the counter in the dimly lit office, the same old ledger open before her. She was wearing a thick sweater, despite the desert morning warming up outside, and seemed utterly unfazed by the sudden, nationwide media frenzy focused on her town. Richter didn't bother with preamble. He slammed a folded copy of the New York Tribune onto the counter, right over her open ledger. The sidebar photo of Ruth and the motel title were clearly visible. "This is unacceptable, Mrs. Calder," Richter stated, leaning heavily against the counter. "You are named as a local source. We both know the information in this article. The details on Robles's plea, the disappearance of Ms. Cole, did not come from federal files. It came from someone who facilitated the extraction of a fugitive." Ruth reached out a manicured hand and smoothed the newspaper flat, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked at the grainy photo of herself with clinical detachment. "I run a business, Agent Richter," Ruth said, her voice steady, her eyes finally meeting his. "I rent rooms. I sell coffee. The Tribune calls everyone who owns a phone a source, if they happen to run a hotel near a news story. I can't control what they print. Don't insult my intelligence. You were the only variable in Ojo Oscuro that Ms. Cole trusted. The gas station fire was a distraction. The maintenance ruse was a diversion. You told her how to leave the corridor." Richter's voice lowered, tightening with menace. "You facilitated an act of treason and the exposure of a highly sensitive federal program. Where did you tell her to go? Which road? Which vehicle?" Ruth picked up a cloth and began meticulously wiping down the counter, moving Richter's hand out of the way without touching him. "You're making a lot of assumptions, Agent. My nephew, Leo, runs a delivery route. He's always coming and going. Maybe she decided to leave with the laundry. The Devil's Armpit Road is restricted," Richter growled. "Leo hasn't driven that route in years. And if he did, his van would have registered on the acoustic sensors." "Leo's van is old and loud," Ruth countered. "Too much noise to worry about, I suppose. Just like the rest of the corridor. You boys worry too much about the quiet, and not enough about the noise you let slip by." Richter knew she wouldn't break. Ruth Calder was the archive keeper of the zone, the only person who operated outside the official system and held the town's history. She was a witness to decades of Site K's expansion and control. "You have been an obstructionist for 20 years, Ruth. I tolerated it because your motel was a convenient place to put new agents who didn't understand the rules," Richter said, his patience snapping. "But harboring a fugitive and aiding the leak of classified intelligence is a crime. You're under federal investigation, and your property is being seized for collateral damage due to the fire." Ruth stopped wiping the counter. The corner of her mouth twitched. "The fire. That was your problem, Agent. Someone left the gas lines open. Faulty infrastructure, wasn't it? Happens all the time in the desert." Richter reached across the counter and grabbed the open ledger, pulling it toward him. "We are seizing all financial records pertaining to the Red Rock Motel. This place is closed. You already took the important ledger, Agent." "That one was just my grocery list," Ruth said, her eyes glinting with a victory he couldn't grasp. "And you can seize the building. But you can't seize the memory. I know every person who has ever checked into room 12, Agent. I know the people who left, and I know the people who disappeared. Hannah Cole might have gotten the papers, but I have the names, the dates, and the truth." Richter stared at her, realizing the depth of her defiance. He had the power to close the motel, but he couldn't erase her knowledge. "You have sealed your fate, Ruth," Richter said, turning away, signaling two security officers who had followed him to begin locking down the building. As he walked out, the security officers began taping official federal closure notices across the motel's entrance. Richter drove back to the courthouse, knowing he had contained the immediate problem. The motel was closed, and Ruth was neutralized, but he hadn't gained any new information. Back in New York, Hannah and Elias were finalizing their strategy. Elias had been tracing the names on the list, particularly focusing on the initial batch of subjects acquired for Project Chimera. "They brought Jennings in 2002, Elias told Hannah, pointing to a document. "But the project started in 98. The first subjects, the test cases for the initial magnetic confinement, were acquired between 1998 and 2000. They've been there the longest." Hannah put on her new suit jacket, the feel of the structured fabric grounding her. "The legal strategy is simple. The moment we file the habeas corpus motion, the federal government must justify the detention of our clients. Since the plea deals were coerced under duress in a controlled, isolated environment, and the real reason for confinement was a classified human experiment, the entire legal apparatus collapses. We need to file immediately. We need a name that will hit the media and the courts with maximum impact," Elias pressed. Hannah looked down at the list of 27 names Ruth had protected for decades. She ran her finger down the page until she found the one that connected directly back to their beginning. "We start with the first person Richter silenced," Hannah declared. "We file for the immediate release of Marco Robles. And we demand a temporary restraining order on the entire quiet zone." Chapter 21. The Legal Bomb. The petition for writ of habeas corpus on behalf of Marco Robles was filed in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York at 9:01 a.m. It was a strategic choice. D.C. was too close to the Departments of Energy and Defense, and New York was guaranteed a media circus. Hannah Cole, now working out of Voss's cramped, windowless office space, stood beside Elias as he sent the final, coordinated email blast to his media contacts. The legal filing itself, backed by the Chimera protocols, was the story. The petition didn't just challenge Robles's plea, it demanded the immediate release of the petitioner and, critically, asked the court to issue a temporary restraining order, TRO, prohibiting the federal government from interfering with the due process of any individual currently confined within the unincorporated area known as the Quiet Zone, or Site K, pending a full evidentiary hearing. The motion was revolutionary. It formally asserted that the quiet zone was not a military or environmental facility, but an unconstitutional detention center operating as a human research laboratory. The response from the federal government was instantaneous and explosive. By 11 a.m., the Department of Justice filed a motion to seal the case, citing national security, the protection of classified assets, and the unfounded and malicious allegations of a terminated federal employee, Hannah Cole. The motion requested the court dismiss the habeas petition instantly without prejudice. But the press was already out of the gate. The Chimera Protocols, summarized by Elias and vetted by the Tribune's legal team, were described as shocking evidence of long-term, coercive human experimentation utilizing electromagnetic confinement. That afternoon, the judge, a formidable figure named Judge Eleanor Vance, denied the motion to seal. She acknowledged the national security concerns but stated that the allegations of human rights violations were too serious to be veiled by classification. She scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning regarding the TRO and the motion to dismiss. "We have Judge Vance's attention," Hannah noted, staring at the latest headline on Elias's laptop. "The legal system is forced to look at the zone now." "And Richter is coming," Elias added, pointing to a small, new update on a defense blog. "DOJ sends top-tier team to New York for emergency defense of Site K." 3,000 miles away, in the now heavily guarded courthouse of Ojo Oscuro, Agent Richter was no longer focused on legal maneuvers. He had ceded the courtroom battle to the highly specialized DOJ team. His focus was operational security. He had received the full report on Ruth Calder. They had seized her assets and closed the motel, but her memory, her archive of names and dates, was still a threat. "Every movement in the corridor is monitored," Richter instructed his field agents. "We are operating under a standing order of maximum internal containment. No subjects move. No subjects communicate." He looked at the satellite image of Site K, the high-security compound nestled behind the town. The initial cohort of subjects, the 98 to 2000 group, had the most extensive exposure to the magnetic field. They were the most compromised by adaptive compliance, but also the most historically volatile. "Dr. Finch needs to confirm the endpoint analysis on the initial cohort," Richter ordered, his voice cold and flat. "We cannot allow the court to order access before we confirm the stability of the subjects. Get Dr. Finch mobilized. Bring him to the zone, immediately. We need to demonstrate that the subjects are incapable of functioning outside the zone's parameters." The federal response was now bifurcated, a public legal defense in New York, claiming secrecy and denial, and a covert operational move in New Mexico designed to preempt the court's potential decision. They were preparing to prove the subjects were too damaged to release, thus legally justifying the perpetual confinement. Back in New York, Hannah was working through the night, preparing her arguments for the emergency hearing. Elias, meanwhile, was preparing a witness affidavit for Marco Robles, detailing the coercion and the chilling effects of the zone's environment. "They won't just argue national security, Hannah," Elias said, looking up from his keyboard. "They'll argue that if we release the subjects, they'll pose a danger to themselves. They will weaponize Chimera against us. They'll try to prove that confinement is necessary for the subjects' own protection." Hannah looked out at the lights of the city. The quiet zone was no longer a silent mystery. It was a desperate battlefield, fought simultaneously in a New York courtroom, a clandestine federal meeting, and the quiet desert of New Mexico. "Then we will bring the real science into that courtroom," Hannah vowed. "We will prove that the only danger to Marco Robles is the ongoing federal experimentation." Chapter 22: The Adaptive Compliance Defense. The courtroom in the Southern District of New York was a theater of confrontation. Judge Eleanor Vance sat above the fray, an imposing figure of judicial authority. The gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and representatives from every major federal agency. At the defense table for the United States stood Counsel Stone, a polished, relentless attorney from the Department of Justice's National Security Division. At the petitioner's table, Hannah Cole stood beside Ann Voss, her new suit feeling less like armor and more like a uniform of war. Elias sat quietly behind them, holding the sealed affidavit from Marco Robles. Counsel Stone opened with a swift, aggressive motion to dismiss, citing executive privilege and the immediate, irreparable harm caused by the leak of classified information concerning advanced geophysical survey systems. He then pivoted to the core of their defense, ignoring the national security angle that Judge Vance had already weakened. Your Honor, setting aside the inflammatory rhetoric and the unsubstantiated claims of the petitioner, Ms. Cole, Stone began, his voice dripping with condescension, the truth is that the individuals referenced in this petition are compromised. They have unique, debilitating psychological profiles resulting from long-term exposure to a high-density, low-frequency environment. The confinement, far from being punishment, is a necessary, therapeutic measure to prevent these unstable individuals from causing harm to themselves and others upon reintroduction to standard social environments. He was weaponizing the adaptive compliance theory, framing the subjects as medically fragile, not criminally detained. Hannah rose for the petitioner, shedding the deference of her former role. Your Honor, the government's argument is accurate in one crucial respect. The individuals confined within the quiet zone are compromised. But the government conveniently omits the cause of that compromise. She walked to the podium, placing the heavily watermarked Project Chimera endpoint analysis, now legally filed as Exhibit A, on the lectern. We are not talking about accidental contamination. We are talking about a controlled, multi-decade experiment. This document, written by the project lead, Dr. Finch, proves that the goal of the facility, codename Chimera, was not geological research. It was the deliberate induction of adaptive compliance. Hannah paused, letting the term hang in the air. Adaptive compliance, as defined by the government's own research, is the psychological state where the subject's neurological pathways degrade to the point where they become incapable of forming or retaining memories of the external world, thus rendering them organically incapable of leaving the geographic perimeter. It is engineered institutionalization. They didn't find compromised people. They made them. She then delivered the crucial blow. The government now stands before this court arguing that because they successfully damaged these individuals, because they successfully engineered their dependency on the quiet zone, they have a legal right to continue holding them. This is not a defense, Your Honor. It is the confession of the crime. The courtroom buzzed. Stone was on his feet instantly. Objection. Counsel is engaging in slander and speculation. Overruled, Judge Vance cut him off sharply. The document is on record, Counsel. You will address the content. If the government deliberately created the psychological condition that now necessitates confinement, the legal framework is fundamentally altered. Ms. Cole, what is your requested remedy? We require two things, Your Honor, Hannah asserted. 1. The immediate issuance of the temporary restraining order to prohibit the federal government from any further psychological or operational interference with the subjects, including their immediate mobilization of Dr. Finch, who is heading to the site now to execute the final analysis, potentially putting these subjects at greater risk. 2. We demand the government immediately grant access to a court-appointed, independent medical team to assess the confinement conditions and the physical and psychological status of Marco Robles, without interference from Agent Richter or his personnel. Judge Vance looked directly at Counsel Stone. The court is not convinced that a 27-year-old experiment can be excused by a national security blanket. The danger appears to be inherent to the government's own actions. Mr. Stone, does the government deny that Dr. Finch is currently being mobilized to Site K? Stone hesitated, trapped. Your Honor, I am unable to confirm or deny the operational status of all research personnel, but I can assure the court that all activity is legally authorized. Insufficient, Judge Vance declared. She brought her gavel down, the sound echoing through the sudden silence. The court finds that the petitioners have provided compelling, primary source documentation demonstrating a prima facie case of potential human rights violations and irreparable harm. The request for dismissal is denied. She looked at Hannah. The court grants the temporary restraining order. Effective immediately, the United States government is prohibited from taking any action to alter the physical or psychological status of any individual confined within the area designated as the Quiet Zone. Furthermore, the court orders the Department of Justice to ensure the safety and unimpeded access for a court-approved psychological team to enter the facility within 72 hours and provide an independent assessment of Marco Robles. You may prepare the order, Ms. Cole. The courtroom erupted in pandemonium. Hannah had won the first, critical battle. The wall was breached, and the outside world now had a legal right to step inside the Quiet Zone. Richter's operation had failed to preempt the court. The war was coming home. Chapter 23, The Clean Room Protocol. The news of Judge Vance's ruling hit Agent Richter like a physical blow. He was in his courthouse office, organizing the final operational status update for Dr. Finch's arrival, when the Department of Justice call came through, notifying him of the temporary restraining order and the mandatory access granted to an independent medical team within 72 hours. Richter slammed the phone down, his face a hard, pale mask. Hannah Cole had not just escaped, she had leveraged the very principles of constitutional law against a decades-old covert operation. The lawyer wins the first round, he muttered to himself, the victory a bitter taste in his mouth. He immediately called Dr. Finch, who was already airborne and heading for a landing strip near the corridor. The final analysis is off, Richter stated without preamble. The court issued a TRO. You are prohibited from making any alterations to the subject's physical or psychological status. Your mobilization is scrubbed. Dr. Finch, the architect of Project Chimera, reacted with cold fury. Scrubbed. Agent Richter, you fail to grasp the consequence of this. If the court-appointed team accesses Robles and finds him stable, the entire premise of the zone collapses. I need 10 hours on site to confirm the endpoint dependency. If the data doesn't reflect the dependency, they'll walk free, and the entire project is exposed. Your science failed to anticipate the tenacity of a public defender, Doctor, Richter shot back, his patience gone. Now, we shift to clean room protocol. We won't manipulate the subjects. We will manipulate the environment. Richter activated the internal alert system, operational security level Omega. The next 48 hours were a frenzy of controlled, feverish activity within the Quiet Zone. The objective was simple: conceal every trace of Project Chimera and ensure the court-appointed team saw only a drab, secure detention facility housing clinically fragile detainees, not human experiments. The cleanup. Site K access. The main research facility, Site K, was stripped. All specialized equipment related to the magnetic field generation and neurological monitoring, the real core of Chimera, was powered down and concealed behind false walls and locked service rooms. The entire structure was designated decommissioned federal storage. Ojo Oscuro Courthouse. Richter ordered the shredding of all local plea agreements, replacing the physical documents with sterile, digitized copies in the federal archives that only referenced the criminal statutes, not the lifetime confinement clauses. Marco Robles. Robles was moved from his isolated, comfortable unit to a bare, concrete confinement room in the courthouse's newly established administrative isolation wing. This move was technically permissible as an administrative security measure, not an alteration of his status, but the change in environment was designed to immediately stress his adaptive compliance and make him appear unstable and agitated for the psychological assessment. Richter stood over a map of the corridor, planning the escort route for the court team. He knew the team would be looking for proof of torture or confinement. They wouldn't be looking for something as insidious as engineered dependency. We give them the illusion of access, Richter told his second-in-command. They will see a clean, well-maintained, if austere, environment. They will see a subject, Marco Robles, who is nervous, confused, and reluctant to communicate because he relies on the zone's field for stability. We don't violate the TRO, we let the damage Dr. Finch created speak for itself. The clock was ticking down to the 72-hour deadline. The independent team, accompanied by federal marshals and, critically, Elias Moreno's journalistic contacts, was descending on Albuquerque. Richter picked up his radio, his gaze fixed on the quiet, empty streets of Ojo Oscuro. He had lost the element of surprise, but he still controlled the territory. "Activate the perimeter broadcast," Richter commanded. "Increase the ambient magnetic field oscillation in the corridor by 20%. Keep it within documented operational parameters, but enough to ensure the subject is optimally compliant and optimally dependent when the doctors arrive." The quiet zone was now bracing for invasion. The war wasn't in the courtroom anymore. It was about who controlled the reality inside the walls. Chapter 24. The inspection team arrives. The clock hit the 72-hour mark, and the independent assessment team arrived at the perimeter of the quiet zone. The convoy was conspicuous. 2 unmarked federal vehicles carrying the court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Helena Ruiz, and a physician, Dr. Ben Carter, followed by 3 heavy black SUVs carrying a contingent of federal marshals to enforce the TRO, and finally, a separate, civilian vehicle carrying Elias Moreno and a media lawyer from the Tribune, ensuring journalistic integrity was maintained. At the main federal checkpoint, the steel barrier was raised, but the reception was far from welcoming. Agent Richter stood directly in the road, flanked by 4 DOE security officers, their posture rigid and confrontational. The air was noticeably tense, humming with the invisible magnetic oscillation Richter had amplified. The lead federal marshal, a stoic woman named Deputy Chief Harris, stepped out first, holding a sealed, court-issued copy of the TRO. "Agent Richter," Harris stated, her voice echoing in the charged atmosphere. "We are here to enforce the temporary restraining order issued by Judge Vance. We have the court-appointed medical team. They are granted unimpeded access to the petitioner, Marco Robles, and the area of his confinement." Richter gave a slow, measured nod, his face devoid of emotion. "Deputy Chief Harris, we are in full compliance with the court order. I assure you, the Department of Energy is committed to the safety of the confined individuals." His gaze flicked past the marshals to the civilian car. Elias Moreno stepped out, wearing a severe black suit and holding a notepad. He looked nothing like the soot-covered handyman Richter remembered. "Mr. Moreno," Richter addressed him directly, his voice tight. "Your presence here is noted but entirely unnecessary. Your legal standing to access this facility remains questionable, even under these extraordinary circumstances." "I am here as a direct representative of the legal team for the petitioner, Agent Richter," Elias countered, walking forward with deliberate confidence. "And as an accredited journalist documenting the enforcement of a federal court order. My presence is fully authorized by the New York Tribune's counsel." Richter's jaw tightened, but he knew the marshals would enforce the access. He had to pivot. "Very well," Richter conceded smoothly. "You may enter. However, all unauthorized recording devices and personal cell phones must be powered down and stored at the checkpoint due to the facility's electromagnetic restrictions. This is for the protection of your equipment and the stability of the zone systems." Dr. Ruiz, the psychologist, stepped forward. "We understand. Our assessment equipment is shielded and approved by the court. We must proceed immediately to the subject." Richter led the team past the checkpoint and into the corridor, the convoy driving through the now desolate town of Ojo Oscuro. The motel was sealed with bright orange seizure notices, a silent monument to Ruth Calder's defiance. The gas station was a black, Smoking crater. Richter meticulously controlled the narrative during the short drive. The individual Robles has been moved to an isolated administrative unit for his own safety following the recent security breach and the destruction of the town's key utility. This environment, while austere, is clean and secured. They arrived at the courthouse, now the site of Robles's confinement. Richter directed them immediately to the newly established administrative isolation wing. Inside, the confinement area was minimalist: white walls, locked doors, and a pervasive low-frequency hum that pressed subtly against the eardrums. Richter had achieved the clean room effect: nothing overtly illegal, just sterile, suffocating federal authority. He ushered the team to a bare, concrete cell at the end of the hall. Marco Robles was sitting cross-legged on a thin mat, his back against the wall, his eyes wide and unfocused. The stress of the environment change and the amplified magnetic oscillation was clear. He looked fragile, dependent, and deeply confused. Mr. Robles has been isolated for 48 hours following the security incident, Richter explained in a low, concerned tone, appealing to the doctor's professional ethics. We believe his adaptive compliance is currently heightened, causing extreme disorientation. Proceed with caution. His mental state is precarious. The challenge was laid bare. Richter hadn't violated the TRO. He had simply let the engineered damage of Project Chimera do the talking. The team had their access, but Richter controlled the environment, and Marco Robles was performing exactly as the endpoint dependency analysis predicted. It was up to Dr. Ruiz and Elias to see past the clinical presentation and recognize the psychological sabotage. Chapter 25: The Noise of Silence. Dr. Helena Ruiz, the court-appointed psychologist, entered the barren confinement cell, followed by Dr. Ben Carter, the physician, and Deputy Chief Harris, the marshal. Agent Richter and Elias Moreno remained outside the open door, separated by the marshals. The low-frequency hum in the administrative isolation wing was intense, a tangible pressure on the senses. Marco Robles, thin and deeply withdrawn, didn't acknowledge their presence. He sat motionless, picking aimlessly at the thin mat beneath him. Dr. Ruiz began the assessment with gentle, standard questions, monitoring his physiological responses with her shielded equipment. Robles's heart rate was high, his cortisol levels spiked, and his nonverbal responses indicated severe anxiety and cognitive load. He would only answer with 1 or 2 words, usually confirming his name and his confinement. "Marco," Dr. Ruiz asked softly, "do you understand why you are here?" Robles shifted, his eyes darting toward the open cell door where Richter stood. I violated the proximity agreement. And what is the consequence of violating that agreement? I am isolated. I can't leave the zone. He spoke the words like a litany, drilled into him over years of compliance. Dr. Ruiz turned to Richter, who stood just outside, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. "Agent Richter, the subject presents with classic signs of environmental dependency and psychological withdrawal. He is highly agitated and fixated on his proximity agreement, suggesting a deep-seated fear of the outside world, consistent with long-term isolation." Richter seized the opportunity. "As I stated, Doctor, adaptive compliance. The environment, though secure, is essential to maintain his equilibrium. Removing him from the zone would be severely detrimental to his mental health and constitute a violation of the TRO's spirit, a failure to protect the subject." Elias, observing from behind the marshals, felt a cold knot of dread. Richter was winning. Robles, stressed by the immediate environmental change and the amplified field, was proving the necessity of his own detention. Elias had to break the dependency narrative, and he had to do it without violating the court's order. He stepped forward toward the threshold of the cell. "Deputy Chief Harris, the petitioner's representative requests 5 minutes of direct, unrecorded conversation with the subject to establish trust," as is standard practice in legal counsel access. Harris hesitated, looking at Richter. Agent Richter? Richter frowned. Mr. Moreno is not legal counsel. He is the petitioner's representative, authorized by the filing attorney, Harris corrected sternly. You may observe, Agent, but you may not interfere. Richter stepped back, furious but contained. 5 minutes. Elias walked into the cell, his presence blocking the ambient light from the hallway. He didn't sit. He crouched down to Robles's eye level, ignoring the doctor's assessment entirely. He didn't speak about the law or the outside world. He spoke about the one thing Robles still understood, the maintenance depot. Marco, Elias said, his voice quiet, steady, and utterly sincere. You were fixing my truck. Remember? My old distributor cap. Robles blinked, his unfocused eyes trying to latch onto the memory. The bearings were shot. Too much heat cycling. They were, Elias agreed. And Richter took the replacement. He told me it was unauthorized proximity. Robles's hands tightened into fists. He said that. He took my tools. They were your tools, Marco. Not the zone's. Not the government's. They were your tools that you used to fix things. And you fixed things that were broken. Elias reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, a clean, brand-new distributor cap, the same part Hannah had claimed she was there to replace. The job needs to be finished, Marco, Elias said, placing the cap gently on the concrete floor between them. The problem isn't the proximity agreement. The problem is that the Snowplow Unit 4 still needs that part. And nobody in the zone can fix it but you. The change in Robles was immediate and profound. The panic and dependency that Richter had carefully engineered began to crack. The sight of the tangible, real-world object and the task, a task that required skill and competence entirely outside the legal coercion, triggered a different, deeper memory. It was the memory of himself as a craftsman, not a subject. His eyes snapped to the cap, then to Elias, and finally, they cleared. The points need to be set at 17 thousandths, Robles whispered, his voice gaining substance. And the timing needs to be checked against the dwell angle. Dr. Ruiz, who had been watching the entire exchange, quickly took new physiological readings. Robles's heart rate dropped almost instantly, his anxiety indicators plummeted. She stood up abruptly, signaling to the marshal. Assessment concluded. Richter stepped forward, his face hardening with suspicion. What is your finding, doctor? Is the subject stabilized by the environment, or not? Dr. Ruiz looked at Richter, then at the distributor cap lying innocently on the floor. She saw the truth. The dependency wasn't on the magnetic field, it was on the lack of responsibility. Richter had suppressed his identity as a working man. My finding, Agent Richter, is that Mr. Robles presents with severe situational anxiety induced by long-term, coercive confinement, and a documented fear of separation from a defined, low-frequency electromagnetic field, Dr. Ruiz announced, her voice clinical and firm. However, upon the introduction of a tangible, competency-based task, a mechanical repair requiring knowledge and skill, the subject immediately reverted to a state of calm, rational engagement. She looked pointedly at the agent. In short, his mental state is precarious only when he is treated as a confined subject. He is stable and competent when treated as a citizen. The court's order for his release is based on legal rights. My medical finding is that continued confinement, based on a fraudulent medical diagnosis of adaptive compliance, poses the greater risk. Richter stared at the small, mundane piece of engine part on the concrete floor, his clean room protocol collapsing around him. The engineered damage had been undone by a mechanic's tool and a moment of genuine human connection. The deputy chief marshal stepped forward, resting a hand on the cell door. Agent Richter, the court-ordered assessment is complete. The medical determination is that continued confinement is detrimental to the petitioner's well-being. We are preparing for the subject's immediate transfer and release into federal custody. The silent war was over. Marco Robles was leaving the quiet zone. Chapter 26. The domino effect begins. Agent Richter watched the marshals escort Marco Robles from the courthouse. Robles was subdued but lucid, clutching the mundane distributor cap in his hand like a talisman. Elias Moreno walked just behind him, a quiet triumph in his bearing. The defeat was crushing, rendered complete by the sterile professionalism of Deputy Chief Harris and Dr. Ruiz, who meticulously documented every step, denying Richter any final opportunity for interference. Richter's gaze was fixed, not on the departing subject, but on the small, silver truck in the motorcade. The truck contained the shielded medical equipment and, more importantly, the hard evidence from Dr. Ruiz's physiological tests, evidence that directly contradicted 2 decades of government-funded research into adaptive compliance. As the convoy passed the perimeter, leaving the humming, charged air of the quiet zone behind, Richter placed an urgent call to the Department of Justice Counsel in New York. The assessment was compromised, Richter stated, his voice flat with suppressed violence. The subject's reaction was triggered by an unauthorized, external stimulus, a physical object introduced by the petitioner's representative. We will be filing an immediate motion to challenge the medical finding, citing undue influence and obstruction of a federal facility. Richter knew the motion was baseless. The transfer was already underway, and the finding was certified. But he needed to buy time to secure the remaining 26 subjects. His focus immediately shifted to Site K. If the court could order 1 inspection, it could order 26. Mobilize all non-essential personnel, Richter commanded over the internal radio. Seal all access to Site K's primary research quadrant. Initiate power down and deep concealment protocols on all low-frequency field emitters. We are going dark. 3,000 miles away in New York, Hannah Cole was celebrating the small, critical victory. Elias's call had been brief. He's out. He's talking about timing and dwell angles. The medical finding supports the release. Hannah and Voss immediately filed the documentation. The medical finding, Robles' sealed affidavit detailing the plea coercion and the psychological manipulation, and a comprehensive motion for a class action habeas corpus petition on behalf of all remaining 26 unnamed subjects. The legal bomb was detonated the following morning. The Tribune ran a scorching headline, DOJ defense collapses. Court-appointed doctor recommends immediate release of quiet zone detainee. The medical detail, the dependency being broken by a simple mechanics tool, was the devastating anecdotal proof that the confinement was deliberate psychological abuse, not necessary medical care. Marco Robles, now in the safety of federal protective custody and under the care of Dr. Ruiz in a non-disclosure facility, provided Hannah with the first-person details necessary to connect the dots. It wasn't just the magnetic field, Hannah explained to and, pacing the office. It was the monotony. The field amplified the feeling of permanence, but the real psychological damage was the elimination of agency. No choices, no tasks, no responsibilities outside of being compliant. Elias gave him his job back, and it woke him up. The class action motion didn't just ask for the release of the remaining subjects, it leveraged the findings from Robles to demand full and immediate injunctive relief, that the entire quiet zone operation be suspended pending a full congressional inquiry. The pressure on the Department of Justice was immense. Congressional leaders, already briefed by and Voss's strategic leaks, began scheduling emergency oversight committee hearings. Richter's motion to dismiss Dr. Ruiz's finding was immediately shot down by Judge Vance, who cited the frivolous nature of the application. The judge then scheduled the class action hearing for the following week, putting the entire quiet zone on notice. Richter knew he had lost the legal battle in New York. His only remaining move was to control what the court or Congress would find if they forced their way into Site K. In the quiet zone, the lights in Site K were dimming. The perimeter broadcast was silenced. Richter had retreated to his final line of defense: silence and concealment. He was banking on the legal system moving too slowly to find the core evidence, Dr. Finch's operating environment and the hidden archives, before he could make it entirely inaccessible. The domino had fallen, but the rest of the structure was heavily reinforced, and Richter was prepared to burn it down before letting Hannah Cole win. Chapter 27: The Need for the Archive. The class action hearing lasted 2 tense days. The Department of Justice fought Hannah's motion for immediate injunctive relief with everything they had, citing the impossibility of rapidly mobilizing resources to process 26 detainees and arguing that the sudden dismantling of Site K would create a massive security threat. On the third day, Judge Vance, tired of the stonewalling, delivered a blistering oral judgment. She granted the writ of habeas corpus for all 26 unnamed subjects, ordering the federal government to commence phased release and resettlement protocols immediately. More critically, she granted the injunctive relief, ordering the immediate cessation of all operational activities within the quiet zone related to Project Chimera, and demanding unimpeded access for a full congressional oversight delegation, headed by Deputy Chief Harris and the Marshals, within 10 days. It was a total legal victory. But victories in court are slow, and Richter's final defense was speed and concealment. 10 days, Hannah muttered, reading the court's order in the Tribune conference room. It's too long. Richter won't wait. He's already moving. Elias, who had been tracking internal chatter from his old contacts, confirmed her fears. Site K is officially dark. The Department of Energy is citing mandatory, comprehensive maintenance procedures before the congressional team arrives. That means Richter is using the time to sanitize the deep research archives. The protocols we have are the planning documents. We don't have the decades of daily operating logs, the real-time data on the magnetic field exposure, the neurological mapping, the individual files of the 26 people still inside. Without those logs, we just have a planning document and Robles's testimony, and Voss pointed out. The DOJ can still argue the experiment was aborted years ago, and that the continued confinement is purely for military security. Hannah leaned over the map of the quiet zone, her finger tracing the hidden path through the motel property. Richter is banking on the legal system's inability to find a needle in a federal haystack. 10 days is enough time for him to destroy the hard drives, deep six the physical evidence, and make Site K look like a decommissioned, empty warehouse by the time the marshals get there. So, what's the move? Elias asked. Hannah looked at the legacy list, the names Ruth Calder had guarded, the names that corresponded to the 26 people Richter was currently trying to erase. The government doesn't keep a perfect record, but the town does, Hannah realized. Richter secured the courthouse and Site K. But the only person who operated outside his system, the one person who kept track of the subjects, was Ruth Calder. She saw them come, and she never forgot them. He closed her motel, Elias reminded her. She's gone. Her archive is sealed. The motel is sealed by federal order, yes, Hannah agreed, a dangerous glint in her eyes. But Ruth didn't trust digital files or court records. She was an archive keeper. She didn't keep her records in the safe. She kept them in the one place Richter wouldn't think to look, the place he thought was beneath his notice, the place she lived. Hannah looked at Elias. We have the court order, but the court order is too slow. We need the proof that connects the names on Ruth's list to the hidden data logs in Site K. Richter is destroying the evidence inside Site K, and we need to retrieve the key to finding it from the outside. The lawyer was gone. The operative was back. I need to go back to Ojo Oscuro, Hannah declared. The only person who knows where the Quiet Zone's true history is archived is Ruth Calder. And the only place she could have hidden it is the Red Rock Motel. Before the marshals arrive and find a clean room, we have to find the archive. Elias didn't hesitate. I'm coming with you. This time, we don't go in with a maintenance order. We go in to find the history, and we don't come out until we have the coordinates for the hidden data. The legal battle had won them the right to intervene, but the final, decisive action required them to violate the court's timeline and race Richter to the hidden secrets of the Quiet Zone one last, dangerous time.